Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Dar's Nights. I know many of you use these videos to relax or fall asleep, so before you drift off, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable and begin. They called them the boys. 5 young men from Yuba County, each with mild mental disabilities, but all high-spirited, friendly, and inseparable. On the night of February 24, 1978, they loaded into a Mercury Montego and never came home. Days passed. Then weeks. Then months. When their car was found, abandoned deep in the Plumas National Forest, it raised more questions than answers. There was no damage. No signs of struggle. Just a cold vehicle in the woods. But the truly chilling part came later, when one body was found inside a cabin 20 miles deeper into the forest. He had food within arm's reach, clothes that weren't his, and frostbite on feet that could have walked out, yet didn't. For others? Gone without a trace. Why did 5 young men drive into a wilderness they had no reason to visit? Why leave a perfectly functioning car in the snow? Why did only one make it to the cabin, and still die surrounded by survival supplies? Was it a tragic accident? A panic-induced flight? Or something far darker, an encounter with someone, or something, hiding in the woods that night? This is the real-life nightmare of the Yuba County 5. And once you hear it, you'll never trust silence in the forest again. They weren't what the world would call ordinary. But to anyone who truly knew them, they were something better, loyal, kind-hearted, and completely devoted to one another. 5 men, all from the Yuba County area of California. Friends bound not just by their shared disabilities, but by something deeper. A quiet understanding of life lived just slightly outside the current. In their hometown, people affectionately called them the boys. Not to belittle them, but because there was a boyish innocence to how they moved through the world, laughing at simple things, finding joy in routines, and most of all, clinging to each other like family. Jack Madruga was the driver. 29 years old, fiercely protective of his independence, and proud of his car, a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his friends listened. Ted Weiher was gentle, known for his warmth, and always looking after the others like a guardian. He was the type who'd give you his coat on a cold day, even if he didn't have another one to wear. Bill Sterling was quiet, deeply religious, and liked routine. He and Ted often went to church together. Jack Hewitt was the youngest of the group, shy but easily amused. He followed the others everywhere and loved being included. And then there was Gary Mathias, the one who didn't quite fit the same mold. He had served in the army, had struggled with schizophrenia, and was known for sudden mood shifts. But with the boys, he was calmer, grounded even. He didn't just belong, he thrived. Together, they were inseparable. Days were built around group outings, basketball practices, visits to the gateway projects, and long, wandering walks through town. Their families trusted the bond between them more than anything else. Each had his quirks, his limitations, his fragilities. But together, they made sense. They were each other's support system in a world that often ignored or underestimated them. February was shaping up to be an exciting month for the boys. They had been preparing for weeks to participate in a basketball game held by the Special Olympics. It wasn't just a match, it was their chance to win a trip to Los Angeles and be recognized for something that made them proud. Ted had laid out his uniform the night before, meticulously folded. Jack Hewitt had talked about it for days, barely able to sleep from excitement. Their coach had warned them not to stay out late. They nodded, promised they'd be rested, and then did what they always did, spent time together. On the evening of February 24, 1978, they piled into Madruga's Mercury and drove to Chico, about 50 miles away, to watch a college basketball game. It was a spontaneous decision, but not unusual. They loved the sport. When they arrived, they cheered like schoolboys, huddled together for warmth, and bought snacks for the ride home. Everything seemed normal. They left the arena around 10 p.m., got back in the car, and started heading home. But somewhere along that return trip, something went wrong. Not one of them came back. To the families, it was impossible. This wasn't like the boys. They had their routines, and above all, they had a reason to return. That game they'd talked about for weeks wasn't just important, it was everything. None of them had a history of wandering. None had ever disappeared before. Their parents started calling each other, then hospitals, then the police. Panic spread quickly, but answers came slowly. For days, there was nothing but silence. Then the search began in earnest. What started as a missing persons case quickly mutated into something stranger. As the days passed, hope gave way to dread. Posters were hung, interviews aired, and roads were combed. But the Mercury Montego was gone. No one had seen it on the highway. No one recalled picking up any of the boys. It was as if 5 people had simply been erased from the map. But the families wouldn't let go. They knew their boys. Something had happened, something more than just a wrong turn. As investigators dug into the case, they started to learn more about the men than just their conditions. They learned about their bond. About how Gary could calm Ted during his fits of anxiety. About how Sterling always made sure Jack Hewitt had his gloves. About how they moved as one, like a unit. Which made the next question even harder to answer. Why would a group so tightly knit, so reliant on each other, suddenly scatter into a frozen wilderness with no preparation, no reason, and no way to survive? No one knew it yet, but the story of the Yuba County Five wasn't going to end with a simple answer. It would twist. It would haunt. And it would leave behind the kind of silence that doesn't fade. The kind that lingers in the dark corners of your thoughts long after the facts have been laid bare. The gymnasium lights never had a chance to reflect off their jerseys. The buzzers never rang in their ears. The cheers they longed for never echoed through the stands. February 25th came and went, and 5 seats sat empty in the locker room of the Special Olympics tournament in Sacramento. Their teammates waited. Coaches looked at the door, expecting the familiar shuffle of shoes, the playful banter, the clumsy excitement that had filled the air for weeks. But the Yuba County Five never showed up. The game they'd trained for, talked about, and practically built their entire month around, it played without them. It wasn't just a disappointment. It was a rupture in a routine so deeply cherished it had become sacred. For boys like Ted Weiher and Bill Sterling, who needed stability, who needed structure, this game was more than just sport, it was a promise. A milestone to work toward. A moment of belonging in a world that often passed them by. That they would willingly miss it made no sense to anyone who knew them. Their families couldn't comprehend it. Their coach couldn't explain it. They had uniforms ready, rides planned, even snacks packed. Nothing about their disappearance fit the lives they lived. By Sunday morning, the unease had hardened into full panic. The families of the 5 began reporting them missing, their calls echoing across jurisdictions. The police began looking. And still, nothing. It took 2 days before a breakthrough came, and it wasn't comforting. The Mercury Montego was found abandoned on a high mountain dirt road, more than 70 miles from Chico. Deep in the Plumas National Forest, far away from any reasonable path they should have taken. The car wasn't stuck. It wasn't wrecked. It had simply run out of gas. Doors closed. Keys missing. Inside, snack wrappers from the game lay scattered, and folded maps sat unused in the glove box. That's when everything became more confusing. The road they were found on wasn't on the way home. Not remotely. It wasn't even adjacent to their route. They had taken a sharp detour northeast into the wilderness, far from anything familiar. The road itself was treacherous, steep, often covered in snow during February. Locals avoided it in the winter for fear of getting stranded. The Mercury's undercarriage showed no signs of damage, suggesting the driver had navigated carefully, even skillfully, over a road where most would have bottomed out. But why? None of the men were known to enjoy nature. In fact, some of them were afraid of it. Jack Madruga hated the cold. Ted couldn't handle extreme temperatures. And none of them had been equipped for a wilderness outing. They wore light jackets, sneakers, and thin clothing, hardly appropriate for the snow-covered slopes of Plumas National Forest. So what were they doing out there? Why would they leave a well-lit highway and head into the dark, frozen woods in the middle of the night? Investigators stood in the forest staring at the Montego, baffled. It wasn't broken down. It wasn't looted. No signs of a struggle. No blood. No footprints. Just 5 missing men, and a car that felt like it had been dropped into the wilderness from nowhere. The families were livid. Theories began forming, none of them satisfying. Some speculated that they'd followed someone, maybe someone they trusted, or perhaps been misled. Others wondered if Gary Mathias, the only one with a documented mental illness, had an episode and led them astray. But the idea didn't hold. Gary was familiar with that area from past visits to his grandparents' cabin. If anything, he would have known the danger and steered clear. And even if he had panicked, would the others, all of them, have followed him without question, into freezing elevation and certain peril? As the investigation grew, search teams combed the forest, using snowmobiles, helicopters, and dogs. But February turned to March, and March slipped into April. Still, no trace of the men appeared. The snow deepened. Hope thinned. And every day that passed made the circumstances feel more unreal. The families clung to small things. Ted's mother believed they were still alive. She was convinced they'd been taken somewhere, held against their will, maybe lost in a group home or traveling unknowingly far from California. Jack Hewitt's family, heartbroken, refused to give interviews. Sterling's relatives avoided public attention, fearing that the more the story spread, the more it became distorted. But one fact remained, the game was never played by the Yuba County Five. The dream they'd trained for evaporated in a fog of snow, silence, and missing time. And the abandoned car, found so far from anywhere they should have been, was the only solid thread investigators had to pull on. Yet pulling it unraveled nothing. It only led deeper into the dark, into a wilderness that refused to speak, into questions that echoed through the mountains with no one to answer them. Because the forest doesn't explain. It only hides. The Mercury Montego sat like a ghost at the end of a road no one should have taken. No snow beneath the chassis. No damage to the body. No broken glass, no blood, no sign of distress. It was as though the car had been placed there, almost gently, abandoned not in panic but with purpose. Investigators circled the vehicle, baffled by its position. The road was rugged, flanked by steep cliffs and dense forest. No tire chains. No off-road equipment. Yet the car showed no indication of a struggle against the terrain. As if someone behind the wheel had known exactly how to get there, and had done so carefully. The gas tank was empty. That much was clear. But even that made little sense. The five men had just stopped at a gas station in Chico. Their tank should have carried them home and then some. Why keep driving into the unknown until the fuel ran out? Why not turn back? And once the gas was gone, why not walk back the way they came? They had passed signs. Had seen towns. There were places of shelter less than an hour away on foot, yet no effort had been made to reach them. Inside the car, all five men's programs from the basketball game were neatly folded. The wrappers from snacks purchased before the game were scattered across the seats. Everything seemed in place. Wallets and identification were left untouched. No sign of a robbery. No items missing. Only one thing was notably absent, the car keys. They were simply gone. Not in the ignition. Not in the glove box. Not on the floor. Vanished. And the doors were unlocked. That one detail lingered like a whisper. Not open, just unlocked. It didn't point to a frantic escape. It didn't scream of fear. It suggested they left the car willingly. Maybe even expected to return. But they never did. The forest around the Montego was a maze of pines, snowdrifts, and icy wind. Any trek on foot would have been brutal, especially with the clothing they wore, thin jackets, tennis shoes, everyday pants. None of them were dressed for survival. None of them had wilderness experience. They weren't the type to explore, not the type to hike for fun, not the type to chase adventure into the woods. They were men of habit, men of comfort, men who stuck to the familiar. This was not their world. And yet something had led them there. The investigation widened. Helicopters scanned the forest. Dogs were brought in. Every nearby cabin, trail, and ravine was checked. But no footprints could be found near the vehicle. The snow had erased everything. Nature had wiped the slate clean. It was as if the car had been left there and the men had simply dissolved into the cold. Gary Mathias became the focus. He was the only one among the five with a documented psychiatric condition. He had served in the military, had once lived with severe schizophrenia, but had been stable for 2 years on medication. Gary also knew the Plumas forest, his family had a cabin nearby. He might have remembered the terrain, might have recognized landmarks. But then, why lead the others into danger? And if he had gone to find help, why hadn't he returned? Speculation swelled. One theory suggested they followed someone, a stranger they met that night, maybe someone who promised a shortcut or adventure. Another darker theory implied they had been deliberately led into the forest, tricked or coerced. There were whispers of foul play. Whispers that someone else had driven them up that mountain. That someone else had held the keys. But that theory had its cracks too. There were no signs of force. No violence. No signs of a second vehicle. And the car itself, according to investigators, could not have made it up the mountain in snowy conditions unless driven by someone with skill and confidence. That narrowed the possibilities even further, and made the whole situation more impossible. Every explanation contradicted another. Every theory closed one door only to open another stranger one. And the car, the only solid evidence, offered nothing. No fingerprints outside the known. No blood. No signs of distress. Just silence. And silence was what followed. Days turned into weeks. Spring approached. Search parties pulled back. Families were left with questions that gnawed at them. The Montego was eventually towed, examined, stored. It became a case file, a curiosity. A monument to confusion. People stopped talking about the car. But its position on that lonely road never stopped feeling wrong. It was a quiet witness to something no one could explain. A vehicle that should have led its passengers home, instead delivering them into a cold, unforgiving wilderness they never should have entered. A car that started a mystery with its silence, and left behind nothing but questions in the snow. And somewhere beyond it, the forest kept its secrets. When the snow began to thaw and spring crept across the Sierra Nevada, the forest started giving up its secrets. It wasn't a hunter or hiker who discovered the trailer, it was a group of motorcyclists exploring the desolate terrain near an abandoned U.S. Forest Service outpost in the upper mountains, almost 20 miles from where the Montego had been left. The trailer wasn't visible from any main trail. Hidden behind thickets of trees and deep snow, it sat alone like a forgotten tomb. Inside the trailer, they found the body of Ted Weiher. He was stretched out on a makeshift bed. Blankets had been pulled over him. His feet were horribly frostbitten, gangrenous. His body was emaciated, weighing less than 100 pounds. Beard growth suggested he'd survived for weeks, possibly as long as 8 to 13 weeks. Long enough for spring to begin its slow crawl through the forest. Long enough to have lived in agony. Long enough to wonder if anyone was ever coming. The trailer had food. Canned goods, packaged meals, enough to survive the winter. Yet most of it was untouched. Dozens of army rations were left unopened. A storage locker full of dehydrated meals sat undisturbed. The cabin had matches. There was paper, furniture, and even a propane tank nearby. But no fire had ever been lit. No attempt had been made to warm the space. It was as if Ted had laid down to die in the middle of salvation. Someone had wrapped him in the blankets. Carefully. Tenderly. Like a person who didn't want him to be cold. That detail disturbed investigators the most. Because it meant he hadn't died alone. The cabin door wasn't forced. No glass was broken. Someone had entered the trailer deliberately. Inside, a window had been smashed, likely to gain access, because the main entrance had been locked. A missing piece of clothing was found over the broken pane, as if someone tried to keep out the cold air after entering. The implication was chilling, someone had wanted to stay. Yet they hadn't. The only body inside was Ted's. Next to him, a watch was found. Not his. A pair of sneakers, neatly placed. They didn't belong to Ted either. They belonged to Gary Mathias. The implication struck hard. Gary had made it to the trailer. Possibly more than once. Possibly with Ted. Maybe with others. But now he was gone. No trace. Not even a body. Only his shoes remained, dry, unworn, and sitting like a monument to a man who had walked away into nothing. Blood-stained linens weren't found. No sign of violence. Just an oppressive, overwhelming stillness. Investigators couldn't determine why Ted hadn't eaten. Why a fire hadn't been built. Why nobody had used the resources around them to survive. It was as though the trailer had become a prison, not a refuge. The location was staggering. The trailer was nearly 20 miles from where the Montego had been left. Through snowdrifts 5 feet deep. Through dense forest. Through ravines and freezing temperatures. None of the men had wilderness training. None of them were dressed for that kind of journey. And yet at least one, maybe more, had made it all the way. Not by chance. By choice. Which begged the question, what had driven them there? Theories multiplied. Some suggested they were chased, herded like prey into the wilderness. Others imagined a delusion taking hold, perhaps triggered by Gary's schizophrenia. But the path they chose made no logical sense. It wasn't a trail toward safety. It was a trek into isolation. A suicide route disguised as escape. The idea of group psychology surfaced. Could the group have fractured? Could fear or confusion have overtaken them? Had someone taken charge, convinced the others this was the only way? There were no notes left behind. No writing on the walls. No signs of panic or madness. Just an eerie calm. Ted had simply lain down and faded away. Outside, searchers found more. Along the road leading to the trailer, they found the remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling, several miles from the cabin, as if they had collapsed on the way. Their bodies were decomposed, likely exposed to the elements since the early days of their disappearance. No injuries. No blood. Just more silence. Jack's keys were still in his pocket. Nearby, bits of shredded clothing were scattered through the trees. Of the 5 men, only Jack Hewitt and Gary Mathias remained missing. Jack's backbone would eventually be discovered miles away, near a stream. But Gary, he vanished completely. No remains. No footprints. No clothing. Just his shoes, sitting by Ted's bed, like he had been there, and walked out barefoot. No one knows why. Why they didn't eat. Why they didn't stay. Why they didn't light a fire. Why they kept moving deeper into a forest that wanted them dead. The trailer offered shelter, supplies, a second chance. But something made them leave it. Or something kept them from ever truly staying. And in the silence of that trailer, surrounded by canned food and blankets and tools for survival, the body of a man who should have lived lay curled under covers, waiting for help that never came. Gary Mathias was the only one among the 5 who had a history of mental illness. Diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, he had once been institutionalized but had been functioning well in the years leading up to the disappearance. He was under supervision, taking medication, and working part-time with his stepfather in landscaping. He had friends, routines, and was part of the Yuba City Gateway projects for the mentally disabled, where he met the other 4 men. Despite his diagnosis, Gary was intelligent, capable, and physically fit. Of all the 5, he was the most likely to survive in the wild. And yet, he was the only one never found. His disappearance wasn't just a mystery, it became a focal point of paranoia and speculation. In the trailer where Ted Weiher died, investigators found Gary's shoes, placed neatly beside the bed. That one detail reframed everything. Why would someone remove their shoes in the dead of winter? Why were they left behind so precisely? And where had he gone after taking them off? There were signs that Gary had been in the trailer, possibly caring for Ted. Someone had used the rations. Someone had attempted to wrap Ted in blankets. Someone had gained access through the broken window. But nothing definitive proved Gary had stayed, only that he had been there at some point. No footprints. No sightings. No remains. Nothing ever turned up in searches that followed, despite months of scouring the region with dogs, helicopters, and hundreds of volunteers. Every search ended the same way, emptiness. That's what made it feel wrong. People don't just vanish. Gary's background added to the confusion. He had been arrested before for violent outbursts during psychotic episodes. One incident involved attacking police officers. Another involved breaking into a couple's home under the delusion they were impersonators. But these episodes had been under control. His family insisted he'd been stable for nearly 2 years. He was attending regular group meetings and taking medication. But when the men disappeared that February night, Gary had left his antipsychotic medication at home. That alone may have sealed his fate. Without it, his mind could have unraveled quickly, especially under stress, cold, and hunger. Schizophrenia can distort perception, fabricate threats, and create false logic. Some theorized that Gary had led the others away from the safety of the car. That, under the grip of a delusion, he had convinced them there was danger nearby, that they had to flee. Others wondered if Gary had simply become the last survivor, watching his friends die one by one, until he too faded into the wilderness, barefoot and delirious, consumed by snow and madness. But even that theory didn't satisfy everyone. Gary had military experience. He had survived difficult conditions before. If he made it to the trailer, why would he leave? Why didn't he eat the food? Why didn't he build a fire? Why didn't he wear Ted's boots if he left his own shoes behind? And why was there no trace of him? It was as if Gary had disappeared into thin air. Theories exploded. Some believed he had succumbed to exposure, and animals had carried off his remains, scattering them beyond human detection. Others speculated he had gone feral, surviving in the forest, possibly even alive somewhere off-grid. That he had walked away from the trailer into a different life, driven by psychosis and the need to escape everything. The most paranoid theories suggested he had been taken, by the government, by a cult, by some unknown force in the forest. They pointed to the untouched food, the deliberate positioning of the shoes, the distance from the car, and the eerie condition of the trailer as evidence of something unnatural. The forest seemed to erase him. Every year that passed made the case more surreal. No bones. No belongings. No definitive conclusion. His mother refused to believe he was dead, clinging to the idea that Gary had suffered a mental break and wandered far away, perhaps to another city, another state. She followed every lead, every reported sighting. None ever panned out. The mystery deepened when cadaver dogs brought into the forest picked up nothing. No scent. No clothing. No signs of a body. He had vanished in a digital age, yet left no digital trace. In a vast forest with a finite area to search, his complete absence didn't just defy explanation, it mocked it. Of the 5 men, Gary was the most enigmatic. The others had bodies, however decomposed. The others had clues, keys, wallets, shoes, bones. Gary had only left behind silence. What did he see that night in the mountains? What did he believe? Was he running from something imagined, or something real? Did he witness the others die? Did he lead them to their deaths? Or was he simply another victim of something no one could explain? In the decades since, people have speculated wildly, but the answers never come. Gary Mathias remains a name frozen in uncertainty. His missing person case is still active. His body is still unaccounted for. His fate remains the most disturbing part of the Yuba County 5 mystery. Because one man reached the cabin, and walked out barefoot into the snow, never to be seen again. The geography of the Yuba County 5 case has baffled investigators and armchair detectives for decades. The route the men took the night they vanished defies logic, especially given their conditions, their destination, and the environment. The facts are plain but make no sense when placed together. The 5 men were expected to return home after attending a basketball game in Chico. They never did. Instead, their car was found the next day abandoned in the Plumas National Forest, on a mountain road 70 miles in the wrong direction. The road wasn't a casual detour. It was rugged, steep, and treacherous, especially in winter. Snow had fallen the night they disappeared. Their Mercury Montego wasn't equipped for such terrain, low clearance, no chains, rear-wheel drive. Yet it made it 20 miles up that forest road before getting stuck, or possibly abandoned voluntarily. What compelled them to drive that far into the wilderness is the central enigma. They had no reason to be there. The road led nowhere useful. No hotels. No camping grounds. No family cabins. The men had an important basketball tournament the next day. They had even laid out their uniforms the night before. These weren't drifters looking for adventure. These were routine-driven individuals, some of whom had mental challenges that made them especially dependent on structure and familiarity. This kind of spontaneous detour was out of character for all of them. The location of the car only deepens the mystery. It was found near a place called Rogers Cow Camp, about 4,500 feet in elevation. Snowfall that night had made roads slick and dangerous. Yet, the car showed no signs of having skidded or crashed. No scratches on the undercarriage. No broken glass. It appeared to have been driven with caution and competence. The tires were fine. The keys were missing, but the windows were rolled down. The doors were unlocked. Inside the vehicle, they found candy wrappers, programs from the basketball game, and maps. Everything was tidy, untouched, as if abandoned by choice. Most importantly, the car had enough gas to go further. That fact stunned the investigators. The fuel tank was nearly a quarter full. If the men had simply gotten lost and panicked, why leave the vehicle? Why not wait for help? Why not drive back downhill? Any of those actions would have increased their odds of survival. But they didn't wait. They left the car behind in the dead of night and walked uphill, further into the snow-covered forest. Investigators followed their tracks for a short while before they disappeared under fresh snow. Their path led them away from civilization, not toward it. They moved higher in elevation, deeper into the woods, toward even more inhospitable terrain. 5 men, only 1 flashlight, no extra clothing, no survival gear. There were no footprints around the car indicating struggle or pursuit. No signs they had been forced out. No indication they had been running. It was as if they had stepped out, locked the doors, and calmly walked into their own disappearance. There's a theory that they were following someone, perhaps someone in a second vehicle. Some residents claimed they saw a truck with a woman and a baby that night, stranded on the same road, and said the 5 men helped push it out. Others disputed those sightings or deemed them unreliable. No such vehicle was ever confirmed. Still, if there was another car, and the 5 men trusted its occupants, it could explain why they left the main road, but the theory falls apart under scrutiny. Why drive so far from the highway? Why continue on foot after the car became inaccessible? Why not turn back at any point? They had maps. They had the means. But they didn't retrace their steps. They went forward, uphill, toward death. It made no sense. The route baffled even the locals. Residents of the area said they wouldn't drive that road in the winter even in 4-wheel drives. It was known to ice over, was barely maintained, and wound through isolated terrain with poor visibility. The fact that the car showed no damage meant whoever was driving knew how to navigate it skillfully. That raised another unsettling question: who was behind the wheel? Jack Madruga owned the car and was fiercely protective of it. Friends said he wouldn't have let anyone else drive. But Jack had no experience with backcountry roads and hated the cold. It was out of character for him to bring his car up such a dangerous trail voluntarily. Yet someone had done it. And the destination? A remote trailer used during summer months by forest rangers and road crews. No signage. No electricity. Miles from any main road. One of the men made it there, Ted Weiher. Maybe more. But the trailer was 20 miles on foot from where the car was left, through mountainous terrain in below freezing temperatures. They didn't have winter clothing. They didn't bring food or water. No one in their right mind would attempt such a trek in those conditions. Yet they did. The route remains the most baffling aspect of the case. Not just where they went, but why they went at all. Every logical path leads to more questions. They didn't get lost by accident. They didn't leave the car in panic. They didn't seem to be fleeing or chasing anything. They simply went the wrong way, deliberately, methodically, and fatally. It wasn't just a detour. It was a disappearance laid out over 70 miles of wilderness. A map with no explanation. A journey with no destination. A route no one should have taken, and yet 5 men did, and only one made it to shelter, only to die alone. The rest never came back down. The Yuba County 5 case has spawned more theories than answers. In the absence of clear motives, forensic evidence, or consistent witness testimony, speculation has filled the void. Every theory tries to explain what happened to 5 men who drove into the woods one night and never returned as a group. Yet no single theory fully accounts for the strangeness of their route, their abandonment of a functioning vehicle, their trek into snowbound wilderness, or the disturbing condition in which one of them was found. The most conservative explanation is that the men simply got lost. Proponents argue that they took a wrong turn, possibly became disoriented, and drove up the mountain road thinking it would loop back to a main highway. But this theory falls apart quickly. All 5 men were familiar with the area, especially Jack Madruga, who had driven extensively across Northern California. They had maps in the car. The road they were on didn't match any logical return path to their homes. It was out of the way, unlit, and in winter conditions. For men expected to be home early to prepare for an important basketball game, the lost theory feels far too convenient. Then there's the mechanical failure theory, that the car broke down, forcing them to walk. But the Montego was later found to be in working condition. It started right up when tested by authorities, despite the cold. The tires were intact, and the undercarriage showed no signs of being stuck in mud or snow. The tank had gas. Nothing about the vehicle's state suggested an urgent problem that justified abandoning it. If they had felt stranded, why not stay in the car until morning? Why walk uphill into freezing wilderness at night? Another theory involves voluntary withdrawal. Perhaps the men decided to spend time in the woods, away from responsibilities or societal pressure. But this contradicts everything known about their personalities and plans. These men, some of whom were highly routine-oriented and dependent on their families, had been excited about their upcoming Special Olympics game. Their clothes had been laid out in advance. They had no outdoor gear, no extra food, and no interest in wilderness activities. Not one of them was known to enjoy hiking or camping. This was not a spontaneous getaway. They didn't pack for survival, they packed for basketball. The idea of foul play has long hovered over the case. Some theorists believe the men were chased or lured into the woods. That a second car was involved. That someone drove them up the mountain, possibly at gunpoint, and forced them into the forest. Supporters of this theory point to witness statements, particularly from a man named Joseph Shans, who claimed to have seen a group of people, including a woman and a baby, near his stranded car on the same road the 5 were believed to have traveled. He said he called out for help but was ignored. Shans' account remains unverified, but it introduces the possibility that the 5 encountered others in the woods that night, and that this encounter set off the chain of events leading to their deaths. Then there's the notion of mental confusion, particularly involving Gary Mathias. He was the only one in the group with a history of schizophrenia, although it was reportedly well controlled with medication. Some believe that if he had an episode that night, it could have influenced the others to follow him, especially if they were unsure how to handle the situation. Perhaps he became paranoid and convinced the group they were in danger. This might explain why they left the car and walked into the woods. But even this raises questions. Why did the group follow instead of staying behind? And why was Mathias, a man dependent on regular medication, never found? The strangest theories are the ones that touch the edges of conspiracy. Some speculate that the 5 witnessed something they shouldn't have, perhaps a drug transaction or secret activity in the forest. They were silenced or chased as a result. Others float the possibility of governmental or military involvement. Plumas National Forest is vast, and during the Cold War era, secretive operations in remote areas weren't unheard of. But these theories, while compelling to some, lack any direct evidence. They are built more on the vacuum left by uncertainty than on any factual foundation. Even the discovery of Ted Weiher's body inside the trailer raised more questions than answers. He had clearly survived for weeks, maybe months, after the night of the disappearance. His beard had grown out, his body was emaciated, and he'd been wrapped in sheets. Yet he hadn't touched the large stockpile of canned food in the storage shed. He hadn't lit the propane heater that was fully operational. Why not? Some believe he was too weak or confused to access it. Others argue he wasn't alone in the trailer, that someone else had stayed with him, used the supplies, and then left, possibly Gary Mathias. But that only deepens the mystery. If Mathias had survived long enough to eat the food and possibly keep Ted company, where did he go? Why didn't he seek help? No theory accounts for every detail. Some provide partial explanations, but all leave gaping holes. The case resists logic. It refuses to be wrapped up with tidy conclusions. Each possibility leads to more contradictions, more speculation. And with each passing year, as memories fade and evidence deteriorates, the likelihood of solving the case diminishes. Theories continue to circulate online and in cold case circles. Documentaries revive public interest from time to time, offering new takes or rehashed old ones. But they all circle the same hard truth: something deeply abnormal happened that night in the forest. Something that defied planning, probability, and human instinct. And it took 5 lives with it, some slowly, some all at once. Until every piece is found, until the last man is accounted for, the theories will not die. They can't. Because nothing else makes sense. When the snow finally began to melt in June 1978, a group of motorcyclists stumbled upon a Forest Service trailer in the remote wilderness near Bucks Lake in Plumas National Forest. What they found inside shifted the Yuba County 5 case from a baffling disappearance to something far darker and more unsettling. The trailer, over 20 miles from where the car had been abandoned, held one of the missing men, Ted Weiher, lying dead and partially mummified, covered in several sheets. What made the discovery disturbing was not just his presence, but the eerie clues surrounding how he had lived and died inside that trailer. Ted's body was lying on a mattress with his head resting on several makeshift pillows. His lower legs were severely frostbitten, and he had lost between 80 to 100 pounds from his original weight. His feet were almost gone from gangrene. A beard had grown several inches, suggesting he had survived in the trailer for anywhere from 8 to 13 weeks. But the details that made this trailer so sinister were what had been left untouched. The trailer had enough food inside to feed 5 men for weeks. In a nearby storage shed, government-issued rations were stacked in neat piles. Some had been opened and consumed, suggesting someone had indeed used the supplies, but the rest remained untouched. Dozens of cans remained sealed, easily accessible, yet ignored. A working propane tank sat ready to be used. Had it been connected, it could have heated the entire trailer. But there was no sign anyone ever tried. No attempt was made to start a fire, despite the freezing temperatures outside that would have made the interior unbearably cold at night. Even more perplexing was how Ted Weiher had gotten there in the first place. The trailer was more than 20 miles from the Montego, and the terrain was harsh, rugged, and snow-covered at the time of their disappearance. Ted had no outdoor experience, no protective clothing, and was not in physical condition to make such a journey alone. He wore only light pants and a thin shirt when he vanished. Yet here he was, far from the vehicle, in a locked trailer that showed no signs of forced entry. Adding to the mystery, items in the trailer appeared to have been used selectively. Several wool blankets had been taken from storage and used to insulate the mattress. One window was broken, likely to gain access to the trailer, but it had been crudely sealed with pieces of cloth and other materials, suggesting someone had tried to keep the cold out. There was also a missing military-style watch found on the table, one that did not belong to any of the 5. This detail ignited speculation that a 6th person may have been present, someone not among the group who vanished. Authorities and experts struggled to reconcile these facts. If Ted had survived for months, why didn't he eat more of the food? Why didn't he turn on the heat? Why didn't he try to seek help if he was still mobile? Perhaps he was immobilized by injury, but even then, why was the food not used more effectively? And if someone else had been in the trailer with him, did that person leave him to die? Or had they died elsewhere? There were signs that others had made it to the trailer at some point. Wrappers from consumed rations were found scattered around, indicating multiple people had eaten them. But no other bodies were discovered inside or near the structure. The presence of these clues hinted at the possibility that at least 2 or more of the men had reached the trailer alive. Whether they left and perished or simply vanished is still unknown. Some speculate Gary Mathias, whose body was never found, had reached the trailer with Ted. Gary had military survival training and might have known how to locate and access such a shelter. He could have helped Ted inside, shared some food, and tried to seek help but never made it back. However, no evidence of his remains, clothing, or belongings were ever found around the area, despite extensive searches. This absence continues to haunt investigators, suggesting he either died far away or successfully left the forest, never to be seen again. Even more chilling is the timeline. Ted's beard growth and weight loss pointed to a slow, extended death. He had likely survived in silence, in a locked trailer filled with food and heat that could have prolonged his life. Yet something, fear, confusion, physical deterioration, or isolation, paralyzed him into inaction. This slow decay within a shelter meant for survival gives the trailer its grim title, the Trailer of Death. It's not just the death itself that unsettles people. It's the quietness of it. The wasted chances. The untouched resources. The absence of violence but the overwhelming presence of death. It's the idea that help was within reach, warmth, food, shelter, maybe even escape, but for reasons no one can explain, it was left unused. It challenges assumptions about how people act in survival scenarios and how quickly the mind can collapse when stripped of hope, routine, or clarity. The trailer has since been removed, but its legend remains embedded in the story of the Yuba County Five. It stands as the most haunting physical evidence in the entire case, a place that should have brought refuge but instead became a tomb. It's where a man died slowly, not from violence, but from an invisible force more terrifying than any predator, the breakdown of human will when abandoned in the unknown. Gary Mathias's role in the Yuba County Five mystery is both central and confounding. Unlike the other four men, Gary was never found. His disappearance deepens the disturbing nature of the case and fuels theories that range from tragic misfortune to something more sinister. As the only member of the group with a documented history of schizophrenia and as someone with military experience, Gary stood apart from the others, not just in background, but in the way his absence continues to echo. Gary Mathias wasn't new to survival. In the early 1970s, he had served in the United States Army but was later discharged due to psychiatric issues. He had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and though he had suffered episodes in the past, by 1978, he was reportedly stable and functioning well under medical supervision. He lived with his parents in Yuba City and was taking his prescribed antipsychotic medication regularly. His doctors described his condition as controlled. He even held down a part-time job and was socially active. His inclusion in the Friday night basketball trip was not out of the ordinary. What makes Gary's disappearance so unsettling is the assumption that he might have been the most capable of survival among the group. The others had varying degrees of intellectual or developmental disabilities. Gary, on the other hand, had knowledge of the outdoors, had been trained to endure adverse conditions, and possessed a sharper sense of direction. If anyone was going to lead the group to safety, or survive if separated, it was Gary. Yet when authorities found Ted Weiher's body in the Forest Service trailer, Gary was nowhere to be seen. Not then. Not ever. Search teams canvassed the surrounding area for months. They combed every path, ravine, creek, and snow-covered trail leading from the trailer and deeper into the Plumas National Forest. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Helicopters scanned miles of rugged terrain. No trace of Gary's body, clothing, or personal items was discovered. Not even footprints or shredded fabric. It was as if he had evaporated into the forest, leaving no clue behind. This absence introduces several possible scenarios, each more troubling than the last. One theory is that Gary did indeed reach the trailer with Ted and perhaps one or two of the others. He may have tried to care for Ted as best he could, breaking into the trailer, using rations, and gathering blankets. But at some point, he could have decided to leave to seek help. If so, why was there no evidence of where he went? Did he get lost? Did he fall into a ravine or stream, carried off by the current or buried under debris? Was he attacked by wildlife? All are plausible, but each possibility should have left a trace. Another possibility is that Gary left the group earlier than presumed. If tensions rose, or if his mental health deteriorated under the stress of the situation, he might have panicked and fled before the others reached the trailer. But even then, his body should have eventually surfaced. Time, weather, and nature tend to uncover what was once hidden, especially in cases of missing persons in wilderness areas. But no trace of Gary has ever been confirmed. His social security number, fingerprints, and dental records were circulated nationwide, but no match ever surfaced. No sightings. No remains. No evidence that he ever returned to civilization. Then there's the more unsettling theory, that Gary survived. Not just for a few days or weeks, but indefinitely. Proponents of this theory point to his survival training and familiarity with wilderness areas. They argue he could have found a way to escape the region, perhaps hitchhiking, perhaps hiding. But if that's true, it raises even more disturbing questions. Why wouldn't he return home? Why leave his parents and friends in agony, never explaining what happened? Could his mental health have deteriorated so far that he forgot who he was? Or, more alarmingly, was he running from something? Was he involved in something that night that he could never come back from? The theory that Gary may have been complicit in something dark has been quietly whispered in some circles. If there was foul play, if something happened within the group that night, was Gary the only one who survived because he was the cause? While there's no evidence to support this claim, the complete absence of his body or any clues lends itself to darker speculation. In high-profile missing person cases, some kind of closure usually emerges: bones, belongings, eyewitness accounts. But in Gary's case, there is nothing. Adding to the unease is a single clue found at the trailer site: a pair of sneakers. They were identified as belonging to Gary. Ted Weiher's feet were badly frostbitten, and it is believed he may have worn Gary's shoes to move around the trailer. That one item, just a pair of shoes, was the only trace ever found of Gary Mathias. No clothing. No jacket. No sign of where he went after that. To this day, Gary remains listed as a missing person. Decades have passed without any credible leads. For many, he is the key to understanding what happened to the Yuba County Five. If Gary were found, alive or dead, it might unlock the truth about why 5 men drove into the woods that night, why only one was found in a trailer, and what terrifying force kept the others from ever making it home. The mystery of the Yuba County Five has spawned a variety of theories, some grounded in logic, others steeped in speculation and fear. These theories attempt to explain how 5 men, all with intellectual or psychiatric disabilities, could vanish into the wilderness with a car found 50 miles away and one man found dead in a remote trailer, yet the others never discovered. The unanswered questions have made the case a magnet for the eerie, the bizarre, and the unexplained. The most straightforward theory is that the men simply got lost. It is plausible that poor judgment, impaired navigation skills, and panic led them away from the car and into the forest's grasp. The mountainous terrain, combined with early winter weather, could easily disorient anyone. The men's intellectual disabilities likely compounded this confusion. They might have thought they could find help or shelter, moving further away from the road and into unfamiliar, increasingly treacherous terrain. The car was found with an empty gas tank, suggesting they had run out of fuel and abandoned it in desperation. This theory fits many missing person cases, but it does not explain why they would leave the car 50 miles away or why they would end up in such different locations, including the distant trailer where Ted Weiher was found. Another prominent theory is that of foul play. Some speculate the men were victims of violence or criminal acts. Could someone have lured them away, kidnapped them, or worse? The area is remote, with limited law enforcement presence. Yet, no signs of struggle, robbery, or forced entry were found at the car or the trailer. There were no footprints indicating a larger group, no tire tracks other than their own vehicle. Nor was there any evidence of assault or attack on Ted Weiher's body. This absence of evidence makes the foul play theory less convincing, but it has never been fully ruled out, especially given the odd circumstances of the disappearance. Government conspiracy theories also surround the case. Some suggest the men were accidentally caught up in secret military experiments or surveillance. Plumas National Forest is a large, sparsely populated area, sometimes used for government training or testing. Could the men have stumbled onto something they shouldn't have? Could their disappearance be connected to covert operations? Supporters of this theory point to the strange state of the trailer, the mismatched clothing on Ted, and the mysterious presence of a military-style watch not belonging to any of the men. But no official documents or whistleblowers have ever surfaced to lend weight to these claims. Still, in a case as bizarre and unexplained as this, such speculation has found fertile ground. One of the most haunting theories is that the men were trapped by the forest itself, either by nature or something more supernatural. This idea suggests the wilderness had an almost malevolent presence, capable of disorienting and isolating the men until they succumbed to exposure and exhaustion. The untouched food and propane in the trailer might imply a breakdown of the mind or willpower, a psychological paralysis in the face of overwhelming fear and loneliness. Ted Weiher's death in that trailer, slow and isolated, has been interpreted as a symbol of hopelessness, the ultimate surrender to the wild's merciless indifference. Some even whisper about spirits or entities in the forest, stories passed among locals about strange noises and ghostly cries heard in the night. While these notions stray from logic, they remain part of the folklore surrounding the case. There's also the mental health factor. All 5 men had various degrees of cognitive impairment or psychiatric conditions. It's possible their disabilities made communication and decision-making under stress nearly impossible. The pressure of being stranded in a cold, dark forest could have shattered their already fragile stability. Paranoia, hallucinations, or confusion might have pushed them in different directions, making rescue impossible. This theory suggests that even if help was nearby, their own minds worked against them. The phenomenon of walking syndrome, where lost individuals wander aimlessly for days, sometimes leading to tragic ends, could have played a role. Ted's slow death in the trailer might have been accompanied by episodes of confusion and delusion that prevented him from using the shelter effectively. Then there is the theory of separation and death by fragmentation. This hypothesis suggests the group split up early on, each member trying to find safety or civilization alone. Some might have perished quickly in the harsh environment, others may have survived longer but eventually succumbed. Ted's discovery in the trailer supports this theory, but no evidence of the other 4's whereabouts has ever emerged. The spread-out locations of the known evidence, the car 50 miles away, Ted's body in a trailer miles distant from the car, suggest movement in different directions, but no coherent path or timeline has ever been established. Adding a chilling layer to the puzzle is the idea that one or more of the men may have been hiding or captured elsewhere, intentionally or unintentionally. Could Gary Mathias, the missing man, have been taken or have disappeared on his own, never making it back to the group? Could others have fallen victim to accidents or even human predators in the forest? This notion remains one of the darkest threads in the case, supported only by absence rather than proof. Psychologists and survival experts have also analyzed the case as a tragic example of how vulnerable individuals respond to extreme crisis without proper support. The men's disabilities combined with isolation created a perfect storm for disaster. The untapped food and supplies in the trailer demonstrate that survival sometimes depends not only on physical resources but on mental resilience and the ability to act decisively, something these men, through no fault of their own, were unable to do. In sum, the Yuba County 5 case resists easy explanation. Each theory offers pieces of the puzzle but leaves gaping holes. It is a haunting example of how nature, human frailty, and mystery can collide, leaving questions that have haunted investigators, families, and true crime enthusiasts for decades. The unanswered question remains: why did only one man make it to a shelter stocked with food and warmth, and what fate befell the others? Why did the car end up miles from the trailer? Why was one body found with mismatched clothes and untouched food? And most unsettling of all, where are the other four? These questions continue to lurk in the shadows of the Plumas National Forest, refusing to be silenced. They draw those who seek answers into a wilderness not just of trees and snow, but of human desperation, confusion, and loss. Theories abound, but the truth, if ever found, may be more disturbing than anyone dares to imagine. One of the strangest and most haunting details in the Yuba County 5 case is the discovery of the untouched food and supplies inside the remote trailer where Ted Weiher's body was found. Investigators arrived at the isolated cabin months after the men had vanished, only to find a small stockpile of provisions, cans of food, jars, a propane tank, and other supplies, completely untouched. Nothing had been opened, eaten, or disturbed. Yet Ted Weiher had died inside this shelter, seemingly within reach of warmth and sustenance. This baffling contradiction has haunted the case from the beginning. How could someone survive long enough to make it to a shelter, yet not use the resources that might have saved his life? The canned food was plentiful and unspoiled, the propane tank still functional. The trailer itself was a rare and precious refuge in the wilderness, offering shelter from cold and predators. Yet the food remained intact, untouched by hands desperate enough to travel miles through unforgiving terrain. This detail implies something deeper than mere physical exhaustion or injury. It suggests a psychological barrier, an inability or unwillingness to consume the available food and warmth. Was Ted Weiher too disoriented, too confused, or perhaps too afraid to eat? Did he suffer from a mental breakdown that rendered him incapable of using the shelter properly? The evidence points toward a mind trapped in panic or despair, perhaps overwhelmed by the trauma of his situation. In survival psychology, it's known that starvation can sometimes lead to an odd phenomenon where individuals become apathetic or unwilling to eat. It's called refusal syndrome or voluntary starvation, often seen in cases of extreme mental distress. Could this have happened to Ted? Could he have been in such a state of shock and hopelessness that even the prospect of food and warmth could not break through the paralysis? Another disturbing possibility is that Ted was physically unable to prepare the food. Canned goods require opening and sometimes heating. Without proper tools, strength, or knowledge, a starving man might still be trapped in helplessness. But investigators found no evidence of forced entry or signs of a struggle that might explain why Ted couldn't use the supplies. The cabin itself was simple, but the means to open cans or light the stove were presumably available. The untouched food also raises questions about timing. How long had Ted been in the cabin before he died? Could it be that he died shortly after arrival, before having the chance to eat? The autopsy suggested exposure and starvation as causes of death, but the timeline is unclear. The absence of partially eaten food hints that he may have succumbed quickly, or that he was unable to summon the strength to prepare and consume a meal. This detail also casts a shadow on the other men's fates. If Ted made it this far, why didn't the others reach the shelter? Could it be that they never found the cabin at all? Or that they reached other places but were unable to survive? The trailer stands as a grim waypoint, an eerie symbol of survival that almost was, a refuge that was too little and too late. The condition of the food and supplies feeds into some of the more chilling theories about the case. Some believe Ted's mental state deteriorated to the point where he refused to eat deliberately, driven by despair or hallucinations. Others suggest he may have been suffering from severe hypothermia or delirium, which can cause confusion and refusal of nourishment. Hypothermia, particularly, is known to cause paradoxical undressing and irrational behavior. People lose their sense of reality and can't take actions that would save their lives. The unexplained state of the trailer's food has become a haunting image in the story: cans of beans, fruit, and other staples waiting silently, untouched by starving hands. The cruel irony of such a scene has gripped investigators and observers alike, a man dead of starvation with food within reach, a story of hope and tragedy frozen in time. This detail also deepens the mystery of what truly happened in the days following the men's disappearance. The notion that Ted was alone in the trailer for an extended period raises difficult questions. Did he know where the others were? Did they separate out of panic or confusion? Did he try to wait for help that never came? The silence of the food jars and the stillness of the cabin speak volumes about isolation and the human mind under extreme stress. Furthermore, the mismatched clothing on Ted, found at the scene, adds to the surreal nature of the cabin's discovery. He wore clothes that didn't belong to him, which some interpret as a sign of confusion, desperation, or an attempt to survive by any means necessary. Yet the untouched food suggests a contradictory hesitation, prepared to survive in some ways, but not in others. The untouched food symbolizes a liminal space between life and death, survival and surrender. It's a physical manifestation of the tragedy, the proximity to safety that ended in loss. It's a haunting reminder that sometimes, survival depends not just on external factors but on the fragile and unpredictable workings of the human mind. Over the years, this eerie detail has fueled endless debate. Survival experts question why a man would starve when food was available. Psychologists ponder the mental state that might cause such behavior. True crime enthusiasts and paranormal theorists see it as evidence of something inexplicable, either a psychological breakdown or something darker. In the end, the untouched food in the trailer is a silent testament to the mystery and tragedy of the Yuba County Five. It embodies the tension between hope and despair, between the possibility of rescue and the finality of death. It forces anyone who studies the case to confront the heartbreaking reality that sometimes, even when survival seems within reach, it can slip away, lost to fear, confusion, or the cold indifference of nature. One of the most unsettling and inexplicable details of the Yuba County Five case is the discovery of Ted Weiher's body clothed in garments that did not belong to him. When his body was found inside the remote trailer, he was wearing clothes that belonged to one of the other missing men, jackets and pants that were not his own. This bizarre clothing swap adds a layer of mystery and psychological complexity to an already puzzling tragedy. The mismatched clothing raises immediate questions about why Ted wore these unfamiliar garments. It wasn't simply a case of random dressing or chance. The items were deliberately worn and appeared carefully put on, despite being from a different man's wardrobe. In the harsh wilderness, clothing is essential for survival, protecting from cold and exposure, so the choice of what to wear is not casual. Yet the question remains, why did Ted wear another man's clothes instead of his own? Some speculate that Ted might have been trying to stay warm and that the other clothes were simply in better condition or offered more protection against the elements. Perhaps his own clothes were wet, torn, or otherwise unusable, forcing him to change into what was available. But the cabin was small, and the limited number of clothes found suggests a level of confusion or desperation in trying to survive. It was not a natural decision to wear someone else's clothes without knowing where that person was or if they were safe. Others suggest a more symbolic or psychological explanation. Could Ted have been attempting to assume the identity of his missing companions? In extreme survival situations, psychological trauma can trigger bizarre behaviors, confusion, delusions, or dissociation from reality. Perhaps Ted, overwhelmed and disoriented, believed that by wearing another's clothes he could somehow merge with or find the lost men, or that this was a way to cope with the hopelessness of his situation. The idea of mistaken or exchanged identity gains weight when considered alongside other mysterious aspects of the case. The men's disappearance, their separation in the wilderness, and Ted's solitary death in a cabin where food remained untouched, all point toward a breakdown of order and reality. The clothing may reflect this mental unraveling, a desperate attempt to hold on to some connection, or a symptom of the trauma endured. Another disturbing possibility is that the clothing was changed out of necessity, but under distressing circumstances. Maybe Ted was injured and unable to put on his own clothes, or perhaps the clothes he wore were the only dry or warm options available after exposure to cold rain or snow. The clothes could have been scavenged or borrowed in a moment of desperation as the group became separated and lost. Yet the fact that no other bodies were found in the cabin, and that the other men's whereabouts remain unknown, makes the clothing swap even more perplexing. It hints at movement and interaction that cannot be fully explained. Did the men regroup at the trailer? Did they trade clothes for warmth or survival? Or was Ted alone, dressing himself in the garments he could find? The clothing itself has been the subject of detailed forensic analysis, but it offers no clear answers. There were no signs of struggle or violence associated with the garments. No evidence of foul play or forced removal. Instead, the clothes appear to have been carefully worn, as if Ted put them on deliberately. This subtlety complicates any theory of foul play or attack. If Ted had been forced into another's clothes, there would likely be signs of coercion or struggle. Instead, it appears to have been a voluntary act, driven by circumstance or mental state. This voluntary act, shrouded in uncertainty, deepens the mystery rather than resolving it. The symbolic power of clothing cannot be underestimated in survival stories. Clothes provide warmth and protection, but they also carry identity and security. Wearing another's clothes in such a dire situation could signify a loss of self or a psychological refuge. It is a physical manifestation of the chaos the men faced, the collapse of normalcy, the blurring of identities, and the erasure of boundaries between individuals. The strange clothing also adds to the eerie aura surrounding the trailer itself. The cabin was a last refuge but also a place of confusion. The mismatched garments suggest a man trapped between survival and surrender, between physical need and psychological disintegration. Ted's choice or necessity to wear these clothes is a silent testimony to the profound disorientation and desperation he endured. This detail has been a focus for theorists who try to piece together the timeline and the men's actions in their final days. If Ted wore another's clothes, did he find the men injured or dead and take their garments? Did the men separate and Ted was left alone with their clothes? Or was this an attempt to confuse rescuers, to disguise identity in some desperate hope of being found or remembered? Whatever the reason, the clothing detail is a key piece in the puzzle of what happened in the wilderness. It stands as a cryptic clue that invites speculation but defies certainty. It underscores the fragility of survival, not just the physical battle against the elements, but the mental struggle to maintain coherence and identity in the face of overwhelming trauma. In the broader context of the case, the mismatched clothing symbolizes the fractured reality of the Yuba County Five. These were men lost in space and time, cut off from help, separated from each other, and trapped in a landscape that seemed indifferent to their fate. The clothes are a haunting emblem of this fractured reality, worn by a man who made it to shelter but could not escape death or confusion. Over decades, the clothing mystery has been discussed in true crime forums, survival analyses, and psychological studies. It remains a chilling reminder that survival is not always a matter of physical endurance alone. The mind's fragility can be just as lethal as the cold wilderness. And sometimes, the smallest details, like the clothes on a man's body, can reveal the deepest and darkest truths of human suffering. The discovery of the men's car, abandoned and out of gas, some 50 miles away from where Ted Weiher's body was eventually found, adds another baffling and disturbing element to the Yuba County 5 mystery. The car's location and condition raise questions about the group's decisions, their physical and mental state, and the sinister possibilities lurking behind their disappearance. The car, a blue Mercury Montego, was found deep in the Plumas National Forest, a rugged and remote area of Northern California, far from any main road or town. When searchers eventually located it weeks after the men vanished, it was clear the vehicle had run out of fuel. The gas tank was empty, with no signs that the men had refueled or even attempted to siphon gas from another source. What makes this discovery so puzzling is the absence of any struggle or violence inside or around the car. There was no evidence of forced entry, no signs that the men had been attacked or forcibly removed. The doors were locked or closed normally, and the car was in relatively good condition. Inside, personal belongings remained untouched, including items that might have been used in an emergency or to survive, such as blankets, food, or maps. The car's location suggests that the men had intentionally driven deep into the wilderness, perhaps trying to get home or seeking a route through the forest. But the question remains, why stop 50 miles from civilization, let the car run out of gas, and then leave it behind? One theory suggests that the men had miscalculated the distance and terrain, underestimating the challenges of navigating through thick forest and mountainous areas. The Plumas National Forest is known for its treacherous roads, unpredictable weather, and dense vegetation. In the winter months, snowfall and cold temperatures make travel even more perilous. If the men's car ran out of fuel unexpectedly, they would have been forced to abandon it and attempt to travel on foot. But the terrain was unforgiving. There were no nearby settlements or facilities to seek help. Without proper gear or survival knowledge, walking through the wilderness in winter is a death sentence. Another theory points to mental confusion or disorientation. The men were known to have intellectual disabilities or mental challenges, which may have impaired their judgment. Faced with a stranded vehicle and a harsh environment, panic and fear could have driven them to flee in different directions, each trying to find safety or shelter. This dispersal could explain why their bodies and belongings were found scattered across the forest and why only one reached the trailer. The car's abandonment so far from the cabin, and so far from help, also raises suspicions of foul play or external interference. Some have speculated that the men were lured into the wilderness under false pretenses or tricked by someone they trusted. But the lack of evidence of violence in or near the car weakens this claim. Others believe the car's location was a clue to their mental state. Perhaps the men were confused about where they were or where they needed to go. They may have intended to drive somewhere else but became lost or disoriented as conditions worsened. The car's isolation is a stark reminder of how vulnerable they were once stranded. The fact that the car was found intact and out of gas also raises the question of timing. How long had it been there before searchers found it? Why did it take so long to locate? The remote nature of the area and difficult terrain contributed to delays in the search efforts, which unfortunately lessened the chances of rescue. Investigators found some personal items in the car, but nothing that explained the men's plan or next steps. Maps were present but showed no clear route that the men had planned. No notes, messages, or signs of intent were found, leaving the mystery deeper and darker. The abandoned car becomes a symbol of hope lost, a last point of safety that was forsaken or left behind in desperation. It shows the men's journey ended not in a violent encounter or clear accident but in a slow, agonizing surrender to nature and circumstance. This detail, the car 50 miles away, empty of gas and forsaken, challenges all simple explanations. It pushes investigators to consider the psychological and physical toll of fear, isolation, and confusion. It forces us to question what happens when human beings are cut off from the familiar and left alone to face overwhelming odds. The image of the car, silent and still amid towering trees and snowy forest floors, stands as a haunting monument to the men's final, desperate journey. It invites reflection on the thin line between survival and tragedy, and how easily hope can fade in the wilderness. In many ways, the car is a ghostly waypoint in the mystery, marking the spot where the men's fate changed forever. It is a place where the journey stopped, where decisions were made that would lead to their disappearance, and where the unknown took over. Among the most chilling details of the Yuba County 5 case is the discovery of food inside the remote cabin where Ted Weiher's body was found. The food, still packaged, unopened, and untouched, raises profound questions about the men's final hours and what truly happened in that cold, isolated shelter. In survival situations, especially in harsh wilderness conditions, food becomes a precious resource. It is a lifeline, sustaining strength and hope. Yet in this case, the cabin contained a supply of food and drink that were left completely undisturbed. There were cans, boxes, and other provisions sitting on shelves and counters, all intact and ready to be consumed, but no one ate them. This strange fact sends a strong message: whatever happened inside that cabin, it did not end with a natural, prolonged attempt to survive. Normally, someone stranded in such a place, battling hunger and cold, would consume whatever food they could find. But here, the food remained pristine, as if time had stopped and the moment of abandonment or death was sudden and inexplicable. Why would a man, alone and vulnerable, with only a few possessions and facing extreme cold, ignore available food? The question becomes even more perplexing when we consider that Ted Weiher's body was discovered in that cabin. The assumption is that he was trying to survive, but the untouched food suggests otherwise. It implies a state of physical or mental incapacity that prevented him from eating. One possibility is that Ted was too weak, injured, or sick to eat. Exposure to freezing temperatures, dehydration, or other medical conditions could have robbed him of the ability to feed himself. The human body, under extreme stress, sometimes shuts down vital functions, and the will to live can falter. If Ted was incapacitated, the untouched food becomes a silent witness to his suffering and gradual decline. Another possibility is mental confusion or despair. In the face of overwhelming hopelessness, a person might lose the drive to eat or drink, even if survival depends on it. The trauma of separation from the others, the harsh environment, and the isolation could have induced a psychological state where survival instincts were overridden by despair or disorientation. The untouched food also raises questions about timing. Was Ted alone in the cabin for long before he died, or did he arrive shortly before his death? The presence of fresh, unopened provisions suggests the latter, that he did not have time or strength to use the resources at his disposal. Additionally, the food's condition provides clues about the cabin itself. It was a small, simple shelter with basic amenities but no electricity or running water. The provisions were mostly canned goods and packaged items designed for longer shelf life, indicating the cabin was a storage or refuge site, not a full home. The fact that the men somehow ended up there, isolated and trapped, adds to the eerie atmosphere. The untouched food has become a central focus for investigators and theorists alike. Some see it as evidence that Ted was not alone but prevented from eating by external forces, perhaps an accident, injury, or even foul play. Others interpret it as a tragic sign of a man who tried to survive but ultimately gave up or lost the ability to sustain himself. Forensic examination showed no evidence that the food was tampered with or poisoned, ruling out poisoning as a cause of death. The mystery deepens because the food was perfectly edible and accessible, making its neglect all the more haunting. The untouched food contrasts starkly with the clothing anomaly and the body's position in the cabin. It suggests that while Ted made it to shelter, he was unable to make full use of it. This gap between physical refuge and survival success highlights the brutal challenge of wilderness survival, not just the environment but the mental and physical state of the stranded individual. This detail has inspired speculation about whether Ted was in a semi-conscious or altered state during his last hours. Could he have been trapped in a state between awareness and unconsciousness, unable to act or respond to basic survival needs? The untouched food seems to answer this question in the affirmative, reinforcing the tragic helplessness of the situation. Moreover, the presence of untouched food brings into focus the broader question of why only one man made it to the cabin at all. The others were missing, their bodies never recovered, leaving the cabin as the final waypoint for a single survivor. The food, left untouched, symbolizes the thin margin between life and death, the difference between shelter found and shelter fully utilized. Psychologically, the untouched food adds to the story's haunting symbolism. Food is a universal symbol of life and sustenance, and its refusal, or inability, to be consumed becomes a metaphor for the men's broader fate, lost, disconnected from the safety and nourishment they desperately needed. It also complicates the idea that the men simply wandered and succumbed naturally. If survival was the goal, and the cabin was accessible, why was the food left behind? This anomaly invites speculation about sudden incapacitation, rapid decline, or even mysterious causes beyond the physical environment. The untouched food remains a silent enigma, an eerie snapshot frozen in time. It is a testament to the helplessness of the men caught in the wilderness and a reminder of how survival depends on far more than just shelter and supplies. It depends on the will, the body's capacity, and sometimes, a cruel twist of fate. In many ways, the food that was never eaten echoes the unanswered questions surrounding the entire case. It is a symbol of hope unfulfilled and a grim marker of the tragedy that unfolded in the Plumas National Forest. The food's presence challenges us to imagine the loneliness, the struggle, and the desperation of a man who reached shelter but never fully escaped the cold grasp of death. One of the most unsettling details of the Yuba County 5 case lies in the clothes found on Ted Weiher's body when it was discovered inside the remote cabin. The clothing he wore was not his own. This fact alone raises alarming questions about what transpired during those final days in the wilderness, the men's movements, and the nature of their ordeal. Ted's personal belongings, including his clothing, were mostly recovered from the car and other locations. Yet, the jacket and pants he wore in the cabin belonged to someone else, presumably one of the other missing men. This mismatch of clothing is more than a mere oddity, it suggests confusion, desperation, or an attempt at survival under extraordinary circumstances. The presence of foreign clothes on Ted implies that he either changed clothes willingly or was given these garments by someone else before he entered the cabin. Considering the extreme cold of the Sierra Nevada in February, this change could have been a practical decision, a need for warmer clothing, or clothing that was more suited to the environment than what Ted had originally worn. However, it also points to a possible state of disorientation. The men, each with intellectual challenges and varying degrees of mental capacity, could have become confused about who owned what, or mistakenly put on clothes not belonging to them. In a survival situation, such confusion could be fatal. The fact that Ted's original clothing was found abandoned elsewhere adds to the mystery. What happened to his clothes? Why did he leave them behind? Did the men share resources, trying to help each other survive by redistributing clothing according to need or condition? Or does this indicate a deeper level of chaos and breakdown among the group? Some experts speculate that the clothing switch may indicate that Ted was no longer mentally himself in those final moments. Perhaps he was suffering from hypothermia, which can cause confusion, irrational behavior, and poor decision-making. People suffering from severe hypothermia sometimes remove their own clothes or put on random clothing in attempts to stay warm or due to disorientation. This bizarre detail also suggests the possibility of an injury or incapacitation. If Ted was injured or weak, others might have tried to help him by giving him more suitable clothes. But since only Ted's body was found in the cabin, what became of the others? Did they abandon him after helping him? Did they move on to seek help, leaving him behind? Or did some unknown force prevent their reunion? The clothing anomaly has fueled various theories, including darker ones. Some suggest foul play within the group or by an outside party, though no evidence of violence was found. Others propose that the men's mental disabilities made them vulnerable to strange, unpredictable behavior, including the disorganized swapping of clothes. From a forensic perspective, the mismatched clothing raises important questions about the timeline of events. When did Ted change into these clothes? Did he wear them for days, or only shortly before his death? Could the clothes have protected him from the cold, or were they inadequate? And why did he not use the food or resources found in the cabin to sustain himself? The clothing issue also highlights the limits of the search and rescue operation. Despite months of investigation, the full story of the men's last days remains incomplete. The body found in the cabin wearing unfamiliar clothes is a snapshot of a fragmented narrative, one that suggests confusion, desperation, and the fragile thread of survival that finally snapped. This detail, clothing that didn't belong, speaks to the human element behind the tragedy. These were not just men lost in the wilderness, they were vulnerable individuals struggling against physical and mental limits. Their attempts at survival were hampered by conditions beyond their control, but also by internal confusion and perhaps the breakdown of cooperation. In many ways, the clothing symbolizes a loss of identity amid chaos. It reflects a man who was no longer simply Ted Weiher but became a survivor piecing together whatever he could in an environment hostile to life. The wrong clothes are a metaphor for the wrong place and time, an ill-fitting situation that contributed to the ultimate tragedy. The presence of the wrong clothes on Ted Weiher also prompts reflection on the bonds between the men. Did they try to help each other? Were these clothes given out of kindness or necessity? Or does the detail reflect the isolation and separation that occurred as they became lost and spread out? No definitive answers exist, but this piece of the puzzle deepens the mystery and the sadness. It is a small, haunting sign of human frailty and the cruel randomness of fate. The clothes he wore at the end of his life tell a story of survival attempts overshadowed by confusion and despair. Even decades later, the image of Ted wearing another man's jacket in a cold, lonely cabin continues to evoke unease. It reminds us that this case is not just about a disappearance but about the human struggle against nature, mental limits, and the unforgiving silence of the wilderness. One of the strangest and most confounding elements of the Yuba County 5 case is the discovery of the men's car, found abandoned nearly 50 miles away from where Ted Weiher's body was eventually discovered. This vast distance between the car's location and the cabin raises significant questions about the men's movements, the decisions they made, and the mysteries surrounding their disappearance. The car, a white Mercury Montego, was found stuck in a remote area of the Plumas National Forest, out of gas and abandoned. It was in a location that, on paper, made no logical sense as a destination or starting point for a trip. The car's position, far from roads, in dense wilderness, implies that the men had been traveling deeper into the forest, away from help and civilization, even as the harsh winter conditions worsened. Inside the car, investigators found no signs of violence or struggle. There was no evidence of a crash or accident, no broken windows, no indication that the men had been forced out. The vehicle simply ran out of fuel, forcing the men to leave it behind and continue on foot. The peaceful, untouched state of the car starkly contrasts with the mystery of what happened afterward. Why would the men drive so far into such an isolated area, especially given their mental disabilities and limited outdoor experience? And why abandon the car so far from the cabin where Ted was found, instead of seeking help closer to the vehicle? The distance between the car and the cabin is a key puzzle piece. Traveling on foot through rough, mountainous terrain in winter is grueling and dangerous, even for those familiar with the wilderness. For 5 men with intellectual challenges, this trek would have been even more difficult. The fact that Ted somehow made it to a cabin far from the car suggests a determination or desperation to find shelter, but also raises questions about the others. Did the men separate at some point? The car's location implies the group was together at first, but something caused them to split up. This theory aligns with search reports that indicated the men were not found together in one place. Instead, scattered clues suggested they became separated, facing the wilderness alone or in smaller groups. Abandoning the car 50 miles from the cabin also points to a critical survival error or misjudgment. Given the car ran out of gas, the men were stranded, but the choice to leave it behind and trek into the unknown likely sealed their fate. It suggests panic or confusion, as they might have believed that seeking help on foot was their only option, despite the risks. The car's position adds to the eerie atmosphere of the case. It was found stuck off a logging road, surrounded by dense trees and deep snow, an environment not conducive to easy travel. The men had to contend with freezing temperatures, rugged terrain, and limited visibility. The fact that they ventured so far into this wilderness with insufficient preparation amplifies the tragedy. The location of the car also complicates the timeline. It implies that the men drove deep into the forest, likely searching for a social event or a basketball game at a college nearby. This makes the eventual abandonment of the car even more baffling, as the trip had a planned purpose but ended in disaster. The discovery of the car 50 miles from the cabin leads to haunting questions about the other men. If Ted managed to reach shelter, where did the others go? Did they try to return to the car? Were they lost or succumbed to the elements elsewhere? The absence of their bodies or any definitive evidence in the immediate vicinity of the car fuels ongoing speculation. Some theories suggest the men may have gotten lost after leaving the car, wandering into dangerous areas where they perished. Others believe they might have been lured or forced away from the car under unknown circumstances. The peaceful state of the vehicle contradicts the idea of foul play near the car, but cannot rule out external factors once the men left it. The car's discovery also highlights the challenges search teams faced. The vast and rugged terrain complicated efforts to locate the men. In winter, deep snow and cold temperatures hampered movement and visibility, making it difficult to find clear tracks or signs of the men's path. The car became a critical clue, but also a frustrating dead end in the search. Moreover, the fact that the car was abandoned with no attempt to return or signal for help raises concerns about the men's mental state and decision-making. Their cognitive disabilities likely impaired their judgment, contributing to the tragic outcome. It also raises questions about the support and supervision they had before their journey. The car, stuck and silent in the wilderness, stands as a symbol of lost hope and missed chances. It was a vessel that might have saved the men but instead became a tombstone marking the start of their ordeal. The distance between the car and the cabin encapsulates the tragic irony of the case. Help was close, yet unreachable, and survival depended on decisions made in desperation and confusion. In the end, the abandoned car is more than just a piece of evidence. It is a haunting reminder of how fragile human life can be in the face of nature and circumstance. The men's journey ended not at the car, but many miles away in the wilderness, under conditions that remain partly unexplained. The car's location forces us to confront the limits of endurance, the perils of isolation, and the devastating consequences of being lost in the wild. One of the most unsettling and haunting details uncovered in the investigation of the Yuba County Five was the discovery of untouched food inside the remote cabin where Ted Weiher's body was found. This untouched food, rations, supplies, and even some fresh items, was left behind as if the men had no intention of eating, or were somehow prevented from doing so. It is a chilling sign that deepens the mystery of their final days and raises questions about their state of mind, physical condition, and what forces were at work in those last desperate hours. The cabin itself was a small, isolated shelter in the Sierra Nevada wilderness, stocked with basic supplies left behind by a previous occupant. Investigators found canned goods, crackers, and other non-perishable items, many of which remained unopened or barely touched. Among these supplies was food that could have sustained Ted, and potentially prolonged his life. Yet, none of it was consumed. The presence of this untouched food defies logical survival behavior. Anyone stranded in freezing temperatures with no hope of immediate rescue would naturally prioritize sustenance. Food is critical in cold conditions, where the body burns calories rapidly just to maintain warmth. The untouched rations suggest that Ted was either unable or unwilling to eat, a fact that can be explained by several possible scenarios. One possibility is that Ted was physically unable to eat due to injury or illness. Hypothermia can cause loss of appetite, nausea, and confusion. In severe cases, victims of hypothermia may lose the will or ability to consume food or water. If Ted was in a hypothermic state when he arrived at the cabin or shortly after, he may have simply lacked the strength or clarity to eat. Another theory is that Ted was mentally disoriented or depressed. Hypothermia and prolonged exposure to extreme cold are known to cause cognitive decline, confusion, and hallucinations. Ted's mental disabilities may have been exacerbated by the harsh conditions, leaving him unable to make rational decisions. He might have been confused about the purpose of the food, or simply too exhausted and detached to eat. This detail also raises questions about the role of the other men. If they had reached the cabin with Ted, why was the food left untouched? Did they leave it behind in a hurry? Did they perish before they could eat? Or did they choose to leave the cabin for reasons unknown, abandoning supplies that could have saved their lives? Some speculate that the untouched food indicates a sudden, tragic end. Ted may have reached the cabin alone after the others separated, arriving too weak to take advantage of the resources. His death in the cabin might have come quickly, leaving no time or energy to eat. Alternatively, some theorize that the men were afraid or confused, mistrusting their surroundings or unable to use the supplies. The untouched food adds to the eerie stillness of the cabin. It creates a sense of suspended time, of life cut short and survival plans left unfinished. The supplies that could have meant hope instead symbolize despair and finality. This detail has been analyzed by survival experts and forensic investigators alike. Many agree that the men's failure to use the food effectively is a key factor in their demise. It suggests that, despite their best efforts, circumstances overwhelmed their ability to survive. Their physical and mental conditions deteriorated to the point that even the simplest act, eating to sustain life, became impossible. The untouched food also highlights the cruel indifference of nature. The wilderness offers no mercy to those unprepared or unable to adapt. The rations inside the cabin were not enough to overcome the elements, nor to compensate for the men's limited experience and abilities. Instead, the food remains as a silent witness to the tragedy. This detail fuels many of the theories surrounding the case. Some propose that the men were victims of a mysterious force, perhaps an unseen predator or supernatural presence, that prevented them from eating or forced them apart. While unproven, these theories speak to the deep unease caused by the untouched food and the overall mystery. More grounded explanations point to hypothermia, dehydration, and mental confusion as the primary causes. The men were trapped in conditions that overwhelmed their bodies and minds. Their instinct to survive was overridden by physical decline and cognitive failure. The untouched food also underscores the heartbreaking reality that, despite rescue efforts and hope, nature was unforgiving. It serves as a stark reminder of how fragile human life is when faced with isolation and cold. Decades later, the image of that cabin with its shelves full of untouched food remains one of the most powerful symbols of the Yuba County 5 tragedy. It captures the essence of a survival story gone terribly wrong, a story of men lost in the wilderness, struggling against both the environment and their own limitations. The untouched food tells a story of silence, desperation, and failure. It's a haunting detail that keeps the mystery alive and the questions open. Why was this food left behind? What prevented these men from using it? Was it physical incapacity, mental confusion, or something more sinister? These unanswered questions continue to haunt those who study the case, ensuring that the story of the Yuba County 5 remains one of the most disturbing and tragic disappearances in American history. One of the most puzzling and haunting details discovered in the aftermath of the Yuba County 5 disappearance was the presence of mismatched clothing on Ted Weiher's body when he was finally found in the remote cabin. He was wearing clothes that did not belong to him, a strange and unsettling detail that deepens the mystery and raises difficult questions about the men's final hours in the wilderness. Ted Weiher's clothing was discovered to be a mixture of garments, none fitting properly or logically. He wore a pair of pants too large for him, a jacket that did not match the rest of his outfit, and shoes that were ill-fitting. None of these clothes belonged to Ted, rather, they appeared to be taken from his companions. The question arises, why was Ted dressed this way, in clothes that weren't his own? The mismatched clothing offers a silent but powerful clue, suggesting desperation, confusion, and a breakdown of order among the group. This detail speaks to the chaos the men experienced as their situation worsened. It implies that the men were no longer functioning as a cohesive unit but were instead struggling individually to survive. One possible explanation is that the men traded or shared clothing to stay warm in the brutal winter conditions. In extreme cold, staying dry and insulated is crucial. Perhaps some of the men lost or damaged their clothes and borrowed from others. But even this simple survival tactic hints at a group under great stress, improvising in ways that led to confusion. Another interpretation is more troubling. The mismatched clothes might indicate that the men separated and left behind personal belongings as they struggled through the wilderness. As they became lost, some may have discarded items or taken clothing from others who had already perished or left the group. The clothes on Ted's body may be a patchwork of their collective efforts to survive. The fact that Ted was found alone, wearing the clothes of others, suggests a sense of vulnerability and loss of identity. Clothes often serve as a form of self-expression and security. Wearing unfamiliar garments could symbolize how far removed Ted was from normalcy, his identity blurred by the ordeal. The mismatched clothing also raises questions about what happened to the other men. If Ted wore parts of their clothing, where were the others? Did they die before or after him? Did he attempt to care for them, or were the garments scavenged from bodies? The mystery of the missing men's whereabouts deepens with this detail. Investigators found no signs of a violent struggle associated with the clothing changes. This absence points away from foul play involving external attackers. Instead, it suggests internal group dynamics altered by stress and survival instincts. The men may have been confused, disoriented, and acting out of necessity rather than choice. The mismatched clothes further reinforce the theory that the men were severely affected by hypothermia and exhaustion. Hypothermia can cause paradoxical behavior, including removing clothing despite freezing temperatures. Perhaps Ted and the others were in such a state that they changed clothes in an attempt to stay warm or because of delirium. This strange detail is a key piece of the puzzle illustrating the men's deteriorating physical and mental state. It highlights the psychological toll the ordeal took on them, stripping away normal routines and leading to desperate measures. The image of Ted in ill-fitting, borrowed clothes evokes a sense of tragedy and helplessness. It paints a portrait of a man clinging to life under impossible circumstances, relying on whatever means were available to survive. The mismatched clothing also complicates the search for answers about the group's fate. It indicates that whatever cohesion they once had fractured. It suggests a breakdown in communication and trust, elements essential for survival in the wilderness. Experts who have studied the case often cite this detail as emblematic of the confusion and despair the men experienced. It is a visual metaphor for the disarray of their final hours, an outward sign of inner turmoil. The clothing's mismatch adds to the eerie atmosphere of the cabin where Ted's body was found. It stands alongside other disturbing details, the untouched food, the isolation, the mystery of the abandoned car, creating a haunting narrative of survival gone wrong. Ultimately, the mismatched clothes remind us that the Yuba County Five were not just victims of nature but also victims of circumstances and human frailty. Their story is one of struggle, loss, and the limits of endurance. The clothes on Ted's body speak volumes without words. They tell a story of men lost, both physically and psychologically, in the vast wilderness. They are a testament to the confusion and desperation that define their final journey. This detail lingers in the minds of those who study the case, a silent but haunting clue that continues to raise questions and fuel speculation. It remains one of the many mysteries that make the Yuba County Five disappearance so disturbing and unforgettable. The abandoned car stands as one of the most haunting silent witnesses to the final, desperate journey of the Yuba County Five. A 1973 Mercury Monterey, the vehicle was found miles from the remote cabin where Ted Weiher's body was eventually discovered. It was located about 50 miles away, off the side of a forest road in the Plumas National Forest, stuck in a snowbank with no gas in the tank and no clear signs of violence or struggle. This abandoned car holds a crucial piece of the puzzle and raises profound questions about what happened to the men during those fateful days. The location of the car was strange in itself. It was found far from civilization, on a steep, poorly maintained dirt road that was difficult to navigate, especially during the harsh winter weather. The car was positioned in such a way that it appeared to have rolled or slid off the road into a snowbank. The tires were frozen in place, the engine cold, and the fuel tank empty. There was no sign that the men had tried to return to the vehicle, nor was there evidence of any forced entry or theft. One of the most perplexing aspects was that the car was out of gas, but there was no indication that the men had run out of fuel by accident or neglect. The trip from the city to the cabin was relatively short in miles, and the car should have had enough fuel to make the journey if properly prepared. The sudden depletion of fuel suggests a possible emergency or detour that left the car stranded in this isolated location. The lack of struggle or vandalism suggested that the men left the vehicle voluntarily, under conditions of urgency or confusion. This implied that whatever drove them from the car was sudden and compelling. Some have speculated that a mechanical failure forced the men to abandon it, but no conclusive evidence supports this theory. Inside the vehicle, investigators found personal belongings but no signs of a struggle. The interior was mostly intact, with items neatly placed or left undisturbed. The men's wallets, cigarettes, and some food wrappers were found, but none showed indications of a violent incident. This absence of chaos contrasts sharply with the tragic outcomes that followed. The car's location, far from any clear path or road, deep in dense forest, raises questions about the men's navigation and decision-making. How did they end up stranded so far off course? Did they attempt to drive out but lost their way in the snow and dense trees? Or were they forced off the road by an external factor such as weather or poor visibility? The snowy conditions at the time were severe. A heavy snowstorm had passed through the region, making roads slick and dangerous. The combination of icy roads and limited visibility may have contributed to the vehicle's abandonment. However, this explanation only scratches the surface of the deeper mystery. If the men left the car of their own volition, what compelled them to venture into the freezing wilderness on foot? The car was one of their best chances at survival and shelter, yet they abandoned it for unknown reasons. Walking into the cold forest in freezing temperatures without proper gear or supplies would be an act of desperation or confusion. Some theories suggest that the men thought help was nearby or that they could reach a nearby road or settlement on foot. Others propose that they were disoriented, affected by hypothermia or exhaustion, and unable to make rational decisions. Hypothermia can cause paradoxical behavior, including irrational movement away from shelter. The abandoned car also raises questions about whether the men were split into smaller groups or all traveled together on foot. The evidence of the vehicle's location, combined with scattered footprints in the snow, suggests some fragmentation of the group's movement. Despite extensive search efforts following the disappearance, the car was not discovered for months. Its location in such a remote and difficult area delayed the investigation and complicated rescue attempts. The delay meant that crucial clues about the men's last movements were lost or obscured by the passage of time and weather conditions. The car has been analyzed by experts in vehicle forensics and wilderness survival. Some suggest that the men were likely trapped by the weather and forced to abandon the car to seek shelter elsewhere. Others question why they would leave a vehicle with food and warmth in the dead of winter. The abandoned car remains a haunting symbol of the group's last known position and decisions. It is a silent monument to their vulnerability and the overwhelming power of nature in the Sierra Nevada wilderness. It is a stark reminder of how quickly things can turn from manageable to catastrophic. In the broader narrative of the Yuba County Five, the car's abandonment sets the stage for the tragic sequence of events that followed. It marks the moment when survival became a battle against nature itself and when the men's fate slipped further into darkness. The mystery of the car continues to fuel speculation and debate. Some propose foul play or external interference, while others argue that it was simply a series of tragic errors and misfortune. Whatever the case, the car's lonely resting place remains a poignant clue in the tragic story. For those who study this case, the abandoned car embodies the heart of the enigma. It prompts more questions than answers. Why was the car left behind? Why did the men risk the deadly trek on foot? What happened in the hours and days after abandoning their vehicle? The abandoned car's silent testimony is a chilling reminder that in the wilderness, small decisions can mean the difference between life and death. It stands frozen in time, a testament to the perilous final chapter of 5 men lost in a forest that never forgot them. Among the most haunting and perplexing details of the Yuba County 5 case is the discovery of untouched food in the remote cabin where Ted Weiher's body was found. This small, yet profound clue reveals layers of mystery about the men's final hours and challenges conventional assumptions about their fate. The food, abundant and seemingly left uneaten, is a silent witness to the collapse of survival and the fragile grip these men held on life. Inside the cabin, investigators found cans of food, jars, and packaged supplies that had not been consumed. These items were neatly arranged, some still sealed. The fact that the food was left untouched suggests that the men either lacked the strength or the will to eat, or something more disturbing kept them from using the resources around them. The presence of untouched food contrasts sharply with what would be expected in a survival situation. When lost in the wilderness, especially during winter, food becomes a critical resource. Starvation is a known threat, and consuming available provisions is a logical step toward survival. So why was this food left behind? One possible explanation is the impact of hypothermia on the men's mental and physical capacities. Hypothermia can cause confusion, lethargy, and a loss of appetite. Victims may become disoriented, unwilling or unable to feed themselves, despite hunger. This condition can also trigger a dangerous paradoxical behavior where the body feels warm and victims remove clothing or fail to care for themselves. The untouched food suggests that by the time the men reached the cabin, they were already in an advanced state of physical decline. They may have lacked the energy or cognitive clarity needed to eat, even when nourishment was at hand. This detail highlights how quickly hypothermia and exhaustion can overwhelm the will to survive. Another chilling possibility is that the men never intended to stay in the cabin for long. Perhaps the cabin was seen as a temporary refuge rather than a shelter to live in. The untouched food might indicate they hoped to return soon, to find their way back to safety or rescue, and therefore did not eat the supplies. The discovery of food left uneaten also raises questions about the timeline of events. How long had Ted been in the cabin before he died? How long had the others been wandering or lost? The food suggests a brief occupancy, possibly measured in days rather than weeks, which complicates efforts to piece together the sequence of the men's last movements. This untouched food deepens the tragic nature of the story by implying that survival was within reach, yet unattainable. The men had resources at their disposal but could not, or would not, use them. It is a stark reminder of how survival depends not just on supplies but on the physical and mental ability to use them. The food also contradicts some early theories that the men died of starvation. If they had reached the cabin, they had the means to feed themselves. Instead, it seems the men succumbed to hypothermia and exposure, conditions that can kill swiftly and silently, even in the presence of nourishment. This detail has puzzled rescue teams and investigators alike. It invites speculation about the men's state of mind, their interactions, and whether they experienced further injuries or illnesses that prevented them from eating. Some experts suggest that the men may have been in shock or suffering from injuries that made it impossible to consume food. The untouched food becomes a symbol of abandoned hope, a reminder that sometimes, despite preparation and provisions, nature's forces are too powerful to overcome. It emphasizes the fragility of human life when isolated in harsh environments. In the larger context of the disappearance, the food left in the cabin is a silent but poignant clue. It speaks to the slow, inevitable decline of the men as they battled cold, disorientation, and despair. It raises chilling questions about their final hours and whether any of them understood how close they were to survival. The presence of the uneaten food also contradicts any notion that the men were victims of foul play involving robbery or violence. If external attackers had forced their hand, it would be expected that the food supplies would have been disturbed or taken. Instead, the untouched provisions suggest that no one else was involved in the cabin. This detail aligns with the broader evidence indicating the men's deaths were the result of exposure and disorientation, rather than violence. The food state serves as quiet testimony to the natural tragedy that unfolded deep in the forest. For those trying to understand the case, the untouched food is a haunting symbol of potential unfulfilled. It is a physical representation of the cruel irony of survival. The men had what they needed but could not sustain themselves. It speaks to the heartbreaking limits of human endurance and the unpredictable forces of nature. Ultimately, the untouched food is one of the many disturbing elements that make the Yuba County 5 case so enigmatic and heartbreaking. It forces us to confront the reality that sometimes survival depends on more than just resources. It depends on the fragile and complex intersection of physical health, mental clarity, and circumstances. The untouched food remains a silent, haunting presence in the story, a testament to the men's struggle and a chilling reminder that even when all seems prepared, survival is never guaranteed. One of the most unsettling details found during the investigation of the Yuba County 5 was the strange discovery that Ted Weiher's body was clothed in garments that did not belong to him. This bizarre fact deepened the mystery surrounding the final moments of the men and raised numerous questions about their state of mind, their interactions, and the circumstances leading up to the tragedy. Ted was found wearing clothes that belonged to another of the missing men, Jack Madruga. This included Jack's jacket and boots, items that were significantly different from what Ted was last seen wearing. The clothes were functional, suitable for cold weather, but the switch was unexplained. How and why did Ted end up in someone else's clothing? In survival situations, it is not uncommon for individuals to share or exchange clothes to help each other endure harsh conditions. It's possible that as their health deteriorated, the men pooled resources to keep each other warm. However, the fact that Ted was wearing mismatched clothing, including items not suited to his size or usual needs, creates a disturbing puzzle. This clothing swap suggests a level of desperation and improvisation. It implies the men were trying to adapt, perhaps trading or sharing what they had in order to survive the brutal winter cold. But it also raises questions about the timing. Did Ted put on these clothes before he reached the cabin, or after? Were the clothes taken from another deceased man or given voluntarily? The clothing switch also indicates a disordered and chaotic situation. The men had become disoriented and physically compromised to the point where identity became blurred, not just literally in the clothes they wore, but metaphorically in their lost sense of direction, purpose, and control. The mismatch in clothing also complicates identification and timeline assessments. When Ted's body was discovered wearing Jack's jacket and boots, it momentarily confused searchers and forensic teams. It suggested that the men had moved around and perhaps even interacted in ways that are difficult to reconstruct. One chilling possibility is that Ted's wearing of Jack's clothes was a final attempt at survival. Perhaps Jack's clothing was warmer or more durable, and Ted changed to give himself the best chance of making it through the night. This act could demonstrate the camaraderie and care between the men, even in their direst circumstances. Alternatively, the clothing mix could hint at confusion or hallucination caused by extreme hypothermia. It is well documented that hypothermia can cause bizarre behavior, including confusion, irrationality, and impaired judgment. Under these conditions, it is possible that the men changed clothes without fully understanding what they were doing or why. The mismatched clothes also fueled rumors and speculation. Some theorists wondered if the men had encountered foul play or violence, leading to a forced clothing change. Others proposed more sinister scenarios involving abduction or experimentation. However, no evidence of violence or struggle was found in or near the cabin to support these theories. The clothing discovery has remained one of the most unsettling aspects of the case because it disrupts simple explanations. It confirms that the men's final hours were not orderly or clear-cut, but marked by confusion, desperation, and possibly mutual aid. Furthermore, the clothing anomaly suggests a level of physical proximity and interaction between the men shortly before death. Ted must have had access to Jack's clothes. Whether Jack was alive or deceased at that time remains unknown. This point adds complexity to the timeline of who died when and where. In broader terms, the mismatched clothing serves as a metaphor for the entire case: pieces that don't fit neatly together, identity blurred and confused, survival uncertain. It reflects how the men were losing not only their physical strength but also the clear boundaries that define their identities and relationships. The clothes Ted wore were practical, designed to protect against the cold, but the fact they weren't his highlights how survival sometimes means borrowing strength from others, even in the most literal sense. It speaks to the human instinct to cling to hope, to adapt, and to protect one another. Yet, despite the warmth the clothing might have offered, it was not enough. The fact that Ted still perished, dressed in another's garments, is a haunting reminder that survival is more than just material. It depends on countless fragile factors, many invisible to the eye. The mismatched clothing also challenges the assumption that the men were fully aware of their decisions in the final hours. It points to a disintegrating mental state where logical decisions gave way to instinct, confusion, and the slow surrender to the elements. For investigators and those who study the case, this detail remains a source of frustration and fascination. It symbolizes the broader mystery of what truly happened to these men and why they failed to survive despite having each other and some resources at hand. In the end, the clothing swap is a symbol of the tragic human story at the heart of the Yuba County Five. It reflects loss, not just of life, but of clarity, identity, and control. It stands as a silent testament to the struggle these men faced against an unforgiving wilderness and the cruel limits of endurance. One of the strangest and most confounding elements of the Yuba County Five disappearance is the location and condition of their car, a 1977 Mercury Monarch, that was found abandoned nearly 50 miles away from where Ted Weiher's body was eventually discovered. The car's discovery added another layer of mystery and raised troubling questions about the men's movements and the choices they made in their final hours. The vehicle was located off a remote mountain road, on the edge of an area called Bullard's Bar Reservoir, a place that seemed far removed from any easy route back to civilization. It was completely out of gas, with the engine cold and no obvious signs of damage or struggle. The car was parked oddly, partially off the road, suggesting it was left there hastily or under duress. What made the car's abandonment especially puzzling was that it was found in an area unlikely to be familiar to the men, given their limited experience with the rugged backcountry. The car's location didn't align with the men's last known plans or the directions they had initially intended to take. It suggested a desperate attempt to move, a disoriented wander into unknown territory, or perhaps an attempt to find help that tragically failed. The absence of fuel inside the car indicated the men had run out of gas sometime after leaving Chico, California, where they had been attending a basketball game. Running out of gas in such a remote area was disastrous. Without fuel, the vehicle was useless as a means of escape or shelter. The car's condition also indicated that the men had left it willingly, rather than it being abandoned due to a mechanical failure or accident. There were no signs of a collision, struggle, or forced entry. This fact fueled theories that the men voluntarily exited the vehicle, possibly to seek help on foot, despite the risks involved in traversing mountainous terrain in winter weather. The mystery deepens when considering the car's odd position. It was not parked neatly or securely but left partly on the side of a narrow road, where it could easily be missed or become inaccessible. This careless abandonment raises questions about the men's state of mind. Were they panicked, confused, or physically incapacitated? The car's location and condition have inspired various hypotheses. One theory is that the men tried to walk to the nearest town or highway to get assistance. If so, why did only Ted end up reaching the remote cabin where he died months later? Where did the others go? Did they perish in the woods, or did something else happen? Another disturbing possibility is that the men were lured off the road or led astray, perhaps by a misguided attempt to find help or by external influences. However, no evidence supports foul play, and no witnesses reported seeing or interacting with the men after their disappearance. The car also became a focal point for search and rescue teams. Its discovery gave a fixed point from which to track possible routes the men might have taken. Yet, despite extensive searches radiating from the car's location, the remaining men were not found until much later, scattered over a wide area. The fact that the men abandoned the vehicle 50 miles from the cabin where Ted died makes it clear that their path was not direct or logical. Instead, it seems they wandered through treacherous terrain, probably suffering from disorientation caused by hypothermia and exhaustion. The car's location, combined with other clues, suggests the men became separated or lost, a common and deadly outcome for people unfamiliar with harsh wilderness. Once on foot and exposed to the elements, they would have been vulnerable to the cold and unable to maintain a clear sense of direction. The abandoned car also symbolizes the turning point from hope to despair. Until the car ran out of gas, the men had a means of escape. Once it was stranded, they were trapped in the wilderness without shelter or resources, an increasingly desperate situation as temperatures dropped. The distance between the car and the cabin is significant because it shows how far the men traveled on foot, likely in worsening conditions. The men's physical and mental states must have deteriorated as they moved through unfamiliar terrain, facing the overwhelming power of nature. The car, then, is more than just a vehicle. It represents a boundary between safety and danger, between civilization and wilderness, between hope and tragedy. Its abandonment is a stark reminder that the men's ordeal was not the result of a single moment of misfortune but a prolonged struggle against overwhelming odds. The car also challenges investigators to understand the men's choices. Why did they decide to leave the car and risk the wilderness on foot? Were they aware of the dangers? Did panic or impaired judgment influence their decision? These questions remain unanswered and fuel the ongoing fascination with the case. Finally, the car's discovery is a testament to the vastness and remoteness of the Plumas National Forest area. It shows how easy it is to become lost and isolated in such a place, especially during winter. The car's lonely presence, cold and empty, evokes the profound vulnerability of the men who once relied on it. In summary, the abandoned car is a chilling clue that confirms the men's disappearance was not a simple accident but a tragic sequence of events marked by confusion, endurance, and fatal miscalculations. It is a stark reminder of how quickly plans can unravel in the wilderness, and how far the men wandered from safety in their final, desperate hours. Months after the disappearance of the 5 men, the discovery of a remote trailer cabin in the wilderness brought the case into a disturbing new light. The cabin, isolated and inconspicuous, became a haunting focal point because it was the place where one of the men, Ted Weiher, was eventually found dead. Yet what investigators uncovered inside was perplexing and chilling, deepening the mystery rather than solving it. The cabin was located miles from the car's last known position, tucked away in dense forest at a high elevation. It was a modest structure, unremarkable in appearance but loaded with unsettling clues about what had transpired inside. When search teams finally reached it, the cabin seemed abandoned but held the body of Ted, who had somehow made it there alone, surviving long enough to die in that remote shelter. Ted was found dressed in clothes that did not belong to him. He wore garments belonging to one of the other missing men, which raised immediate questions. Why would Ted be wearing someone else's clothes? Was it a desperate attempt to stay warm, or a sign of deeper confusion and disorientation? The mismatched clothing was one of the most eerie details in the case, suggesting the men were in survival mode, stripping and sharing what they could to endure the brutal cold. Inside the cabin, investigators found food, left untouched. Cans of beans, packets of crackers, and other non-perishable items remained sealed and uneaten. This detail baffled those involved in the search and investigation. If Ted had made it all the way to this refuge, why had he not eaten? Was he too weak, too sick, or too disoriented to eat? Or was he holding on to the food for some reason, perhaps to ration or share with the others who never arrived? The presence of uneaten food inside the cabin suggested that Ted might have died suddenly or was incapacitated before he could nourish himself. It painted a tragic picture of a man on the brink of survival who ultimately failed. It also implied that the cabin might have been reached late in the ordeal, after long days of wandering and struggle. The cabin itself was sparse and lacked amenities, offering little comfort. There was no electricity or running water, and it was unclear how Ted had accessed it. The cabin was not marked on many maps, and its existence was not widely known, making it unlikely the men stumbled upon it by accident. Some theorize that the men knew of the cabin or had been told about it, while others believe it was a final desperate hope when everything else failed. Forensic analysis did not reveal evidence of violence or foul play inside the cabin. Ted's death appeared natural, likely from hypothermia, starvation, or exposure. Yet the question remained, how did he survive the trek from the car to this distant shelter while the others did not? Was Ted separated from the group early on, or did they become scattered after leaving the vehicle? The cabin discovery also raised questions about the other 4 men who never made it there. Did they die elsewhere in the forest, lost and vulnerable? Did they try to follow Ted, or did they choose different paths? The silence of the wilderness swallowed their fates, leaving only Ted's lonely resting place as a grim testament to their ordeal. Another haunting detail was the lack of a clear trail leading to or from the cabin. Searchers found no obvious signs of passage, no footprints, no discarded gear, no signs of campfires or shelters. This absence suggested the men's movements were erratic, perhaps impaired by confusion or the effects of cold exposure. The mystery of why Ted wore someone else's clothes and left the food untouched inside the cabin has spawned many theories, each more unsettling than the last. Some speculate that Ted, suffering from severe hypothermia, was experiencing paradoxical undressing, a condition where victims of cold remove their clothing due to altered mental states, only to worsen their exposure. Perhaps in his final moments, Ted exchanged clothes with a fallen companion, unaware or unable to distinguish his own identity. The untouched food remains a chilling enigma. It defies common survival instinct. Most people lost in the wilderness will eat anything to stay alive. That Ted did not suggest extreme weakness or mental confusion. Alternatively, it could indicate a delay between arrival and death, maybe Ted survived only briefly before succumbing to the elements. The cabin itself stands as a monument to isolation and tragedy. Its remote location and the way it held one man's last moments invite speculation about the cruelty of wilderness survival and the limits of human endurance. It is a place that, despite being a shelter, became a tomb, a silent witness to a desperate struggle. The fact that Ted was found alone in the cabin while the others vanished elsewhere adds to the chilling nature of the story. It implies a fracturing of the group, an unraveling of companionship and hope. The men who had started together ended their journey scattered across miles of harsh wilderness, each facing the cold in his own way. The cabin also becomes a symbol of unanswered questions and haunting what-ifs. What if the others had reached it? What if Ted had managed to eat the food and survive longer? What forces, internal or external, pushed these men to such extremes? Despite extensive investigations and media attention, the cabin remains a mysterious silent piece of the puzzle. It neither explains nor absolves the fate of the 5 men but instead deepens the sense of loss and confusion that surrounds their disappearance. In the end, the cabin discovery is a chilling reminder of the dangers lurking in the wilderness, especially for those ill-prepared or vulnerable. It embodies the grim reality that nature, in its unforgiving silence and isolation, can overwhelm even the strongest human spirit. The disappearance of the Yuba County 5 has defied easy explanation for over 4 decades, leaving investigators, families, and armchair detectives grappling with a labyrinth of theories and unsettling speculations. The story of 5 men vanishing into the California wilderness, only for one to be found dead in a remote cabin, clad in mismatched clothes, with food left untouched, remains one of America's most baffling and disturbing mysteries. One of the earliest theories posited that the men simply got lost. After all, the Plumas National Forest is vast and unforgiving terrain, thick with dense trees, steep slopes, and unpredictable weather. Even for experienced outdoorsmen, the forest can be a disorienting maze. The group's mental disabilities, combined with their unfamiliarity with the wilderness, likely made navigation nearly impossible once they were off the beaten path. It's plausible that in their efforts to find help, they wandered farther and farther into the forest, becoming increasingly exhausted and vulnerable. This scenario, while straightforward, doesn't fully explain the strange circumstances of their last known locations or why only one man reached the cabin. Another line of speculation involves foul play. Could the men have been lured into the forest by malicious intent? The discovery of the car abandoned with no signs of struggle suggests they left voluntarily, but that doesn't rule out the possibility that someone else was involved. Perhaps they encountered someone, or something, that caused their disappearance. However, no evidence of violence or human intervention was found at any site related to the case. The lack of struggle, no signs of assault, or any clues pointing to a perpetrator made this theory difficult to substantiate. Some theories veer into the realm of government conspiracies and secret experiments. The late 1970s was a time rife with public suspicion about clandestine government activities, particularly those involving mind control, covert testing, or experimentation on vulnerable populations. Given that all 5 men had mental disabilities, some have speculated they might have been unknowingly involved in such programs or were targets of sinister forces. This explanation, while intriguing to conspiracy enthusiasts, lacks concrete evidence. No credible government connection was ever proven, and investigations failed to uncover anything beyond the men's personal histories and the physical evidence from the forest. The condition of Ted Weiher's body and his strange clothing have fueled theories about the effects of hypothermia and mental confusion. Medical experts know that hypothermia can cause paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where victims, as their body temperatures drop, remove their clothes despite the freezing cold. This could explain why Ted wore someone else's clothes, perhaps those of a companion who had perished or was incapacitated. It's also possible the men shared clothes in a desperate attempt to stay warm or replace wet or damaged garments. However, this still leaves the question, why did Ted not eat the food found in the cabin? Was he too weak, too delirious, or was something else at play? The untouched food might indicate Ted's rapid decline after reaching the cabin, a brief survival window where he simply could not sustain himself. But it also raises eerie questions. Did Ted intend to share the food with the others, hoping they would arrive? Or was he too confused and unable to act? The silence around this detail haunts the narrative, suggesting a tragic final chapter filled with hope unfulfilled. Some investigators have considered psychological factors that might have driven the men to separate and wander off alone. Mental illness, stress, confusion from cold exposure, and fear could have fragmented the group, each man facing his own reality in the wilderness. This fracturing may have led to their scattered fates, some dying quickly, others wandering further in futile attempts to find safety. Adding to the enigma are unconfirmed reports from locals and search teams of strange sounds and lights in the forest during the search. Some claim to have heard cries for help, while others described eerie feelings of being watched. Though such accounts are anecdotal, they contribute to the supernatural undertones that some associate with the case. Whether these reports stem from heightened emotions during the search or something more inexplicable remains unknown. Over the years, books, documentaries, and podcasts have kept the Yuba County 5 story alive, each offering new interpretations and speculations. Some focus on human error and the mercilessness of nature, while others delve into psychological horror, the terror of being lost, isolated, and alone in an immense wilderness that seems to swallow hope whole. The men's families have also weighed in, haunted by unanswered questions and the slow unraveling of the truth. Their grief is compounded by the mystery itself, a story without closure, a puzzle missing key pieces. For them, the case is not just a cold file, it is a painful chapter marked by loss, uncertainty, and the haunting what-ifs. In the final analysis, the Yuba County 5 case remains a testament to the unpredictable and unforgiving nature of the wilderness, the fragility of the human mind under stress, and the profound mysteries that can unfold when 5 lives vanish without trace. The cabin, the clothes, the untouched food, these details are echoes of a tragedy that refuses to be fully understood. Why did only Ted survive long enough to reach that cabin, and what stopped him from living longer? What happened to the other 4 men, scattered and lost in the vast forest? Were they victims of circumstance, or did something more sinister intervene? No one knows for sure. The answers may never come. The Yuba County 5 vanishings stand as a disturbing reminder of nature's power, human vulnerability, and the shadows that can linger in the quiet corners of forgotten forests. The Yuba County 5 case lingers in the collective consciousness as a haunting, unresolved enigma. It's a story that defies the neat closure most tragedies demand, instead offering an open wound of questions that refuse to heal. 4 men disappeared into the forest's cold embrace, and one was found dead under circumstances so strange they invite endless speculation. Why has this mystery endured for so long, capturing attention decades after the men vanished? One reason is the paradox at the heart of the case. On one hand, it's a painfully human story of vulnerability, isolation, and the harsh consequences of nature's indifferent force. On the other hand, it's wrapped in layers of inexplicable details, a car abandoned with no struggle, bodies scattered in impossible locations, a man found wearing clothes that weren't his own, food left untouched. These contradictions defy logic and invite questions that have no definitive answers. The mystery taps into deep fears, being lost, being forgotten, the idea that the wilderness can swallow a person whole without a trace. It challenges our assumptions about safety, control, and the limits of human endurance. The Yuba County 5 are not just missing men, they represent the unknown, the terrifying possibility that even in the modern world, nature can reclaim those who stray too far. The men's mental disabilities add a layer of tragedy and complexity. They were vulnerable, misunderstood, and dependent on routines and support that were absent on that fateful night. Their impairments made their disappearance even more heart-wrenching, not only for the men themselves but for the families who waited helplessly for answers. The case raises questions about how society cares for the mentally disabled and the dangers they face when separated from familiar support systems. Over the years, the story has evolved into a cautionary tale. It reminds adventurers and families alike of the wilderness's perils and the importance of preparation, navigation skills, and community support. Yet, even as lessons have been drawn, the questions remain. Some have tried to rationalize the events by reconstructing the men's last movements, hoping technology or new evidence might provide clarity. Others have delved into psychological theories about group behavior under stress, hypothermia-induced confusion, and survival instincts gone awry. Yet none of these explanations capture the full picture or explain the oddities that make the case so disturbing. The lingering unanswered questions invite speculation about what might have been missed during the initial investigations. Could new forensic techniques, modern mapping technology, or re-examination of physical evidence provide insights? Or is the case doomed to remain locked in the past, a ghost story without a ghost? Part of what keeps the case alive in public imagination is its unsolvable nature. Unlike many tragedies that culminate in courtrooms or final reports, the Yuba County 5 case leaves space for the unknown. It invites theories, some grounded, others wild, and encourages us to confront the discomfort of uncertainty. The story also speaks to the human need for closure and understanding. When answers aren't forthcoming, our minds fill the gaps with speculation, hoping to make sense of chaos. The men's disappearance is a canvas for our fears and hopes, a mirror reflecting our vulnerabilities. Even today, as hikers, search teams, and families venture into the Plumas National Forest, the spirit of the Yuba County 5 lingers. They serve as a solemn reminder that wilderness exploration carries real risks, especially for those ill-prepared or vulnerable. Their story continues to warn and haunt, a testament to the enduring power of mystery. Ultimately, the Yuba County Five's fate may never be fully understood. The men's disappearance remains a puzzle with missing pieces, their final moments shrouded in cold silence. Yet, the impact of their story endures, an echo of loss, mystery, and the unknown depths that lie beyond the edge of civilization. Why did only one of the five reach that remote cabin? Why was he dressed in unfamiliar clothes and unable to eat? What happened to the others scattered across the wilderness? These questions remain unanswered, a chilling reminder that some mysteries resist explanation. In the end, the Yuba County Five are more than just a case file or a news story. They are a symbol of human fragility against the vast, indifferent wilderness. Their disappearance challenges us to remember those lost to the unknown and to respect the powerful forces of nature that surround us. Thank you for joining me on this chilling journey into one of America's most baffling disappearances, the Yuba County Five. A story filled with mystery, unanswered questions, and the haunting reality of how quickly life can unravel in the wilderness. If you found this story as gripping and disturbing as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into true crime mysteries that refuse to be forgotten. Have your own theories about what happened to the Yuba County Five? Share them in the comments below. I want to hear your thoughts and ideas. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, some mysteries are darker than the night itself. This is Mr. Dark's Nights, signing off.